The Countess Kathleen O'Shea by William Butler Yeats. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chris Tierney. The Countess Kathleen O'Shea, a Folktale Retold. A very long time ago, there suddenly appeared in old Ireland 2 unknown merchants of whom nobody had ever heard, and who nevertheless spoke the language of the country with the greatest perfection. Their locks were black and bound round with gold, and their garments were of rare magnificence. Both seemed of like age. They appeared to be men of 50, for their foreheads were wrinkled and their beards tinged with grey. In the hostelry where the pompous traders alighted, it was sought to penetrate their designs, but in vain. They led a silent and retired life. And whilst they stopped there, they did nothing but count over and over again out of their money bags pieces of gold, whose yellow brightness could be seen through the windows of their lodging. "Gentlemen," said the landlady one day, "how is it that you are so rich, and that, being able to succor the public misery, you do no good works?" "Fair hostess," replied one of them, "we didn't like to present alms to the honest poor, in dread we might be deceived by make-believe paupers. Let want knock at our door, we shall open it." The following day, when the rumor spread that 2 rich strangers had come, ready to lavish their gold, a crowd besieged their dwelling, but the figures of those who came out were widely different. Some carried pride in their mien, others were shamefaced. The 2 chapmen traded in souls for the demon. The soul of the aged was worth 20 pieces of gold, not a penny more, for Satan had had time to make his valuation. The soul of a matron was valued at 50 when she was handsome, and 100 when she was ugly. The soul of a young maiden fetched an extravagant sum. The freshest and purest flowers are the dearest. At that time there lived in the city an angel of beauty, the Countess Kathleen O'Shea. She was the idol of the people and the providence of the indigent. As soon as she learned that these miscreants profited by the public misery to steal away hearts from God, she called to her butler. "Patrick," she said to him, "how many pieces of gold in my coffers?" 100,000. "How many jewels?" "The money's worth of the gold." "How much property in castles, forests, and lands?" "Double the rest." "Very well, Patrick. Sell all that is not gold, and bring me the account. I only wish to keep this mansion and the domain that surrounds it." 2 days afterwards, the orders of the pious Kathleen were executed, and the treasure was distributed to the poor in proportion to their wants. This, says the tradition, did not suit the purposes of the evil spirit, who found no more souls to purchase. Aided by an infamous servant, they penetrated into the retreat of the noble dame, and purloined from her the rest of her treasure. In vain she struggled with all her strength to save the contents of her coffers. The diabolical thieves were the stronger. If Kathleen had been able to make the sign of the cross, adds the legend, she would have put them to flight, but her hands were captive. The larceny was effected. Then the poor called for aid to the plundered Kathleen. Alas, to no good. She was able to succor their misery no longer. She had to abandon them to the temptation. Meanwhile, but 8 days had to pass before the grain and provender would arrive in abundance from the western lands. 8 such days were an age. 8 days required an immense sum to relieve the exigencies of the dearth, and the poor should either perish in the agonies of hunger, or, denying the holy maxims of the gospel, vend for base lucre their souls, the richest gift from the bounteous hand of the Almighty. And Kathleen hadn't anything, for she had given up her mansion to the unhappy. She passed 12 hours in tears and mourning, rending her sun-tinted hair and bruising her breast of the whiteness of the lily. Afterwards she stood up, resolute, animated by a vivid sentiment of despair. She went to the traders in souls. "What do you want?" they said. "You buy souls?" "Yes, a few still, in spite of you. Isn't that so, saint with the eyes of sapphire?" "Today I am come to offer you a bargain," replied she. "What?" "I have a soul to sell, but it is costly." "What does that signify if it is precious? The soul, like the diamond, is appraised by its transparency." "It is mine." The two emissaries of Satan started. Their claws were clutched under their gloves of leather. Their gray eyes sparkled. The soul, pure, spotless, virginal of Kathleen. It was a priceless acquisition. "Beauteous lady, how much do you ask?" 150,000 pieces of gold." "It's at your service," replied the traders, and they tendered Kathleen a parchment sealed with black, which she signed with a shudder. The sum was counted out to her. As soon as she got home, she said to the butler, "Here, distribute this. With this money that I give you, the poor can tide over the 8 days that remain, and not one of their souls will be delivered to the demon." Afterwards, she shut herself up in her room and gave orders that none should disturb her. 3 days passed. She called nobody. She did not come out. When the door was opened, they found her cold and stiff. She was dead of grief. But the sale of this soul, so adorable in its charity, was declared null by the Lord, for she had saved her fellow citizens from eternal death. After the 8 days had passed, numerous vessels brought into famished Ireland immense provisions and grain. Hunger was no longer possible. As to the traders, they disappeared from their hotel without anyone knowing what became of them. But the fishermen of the Blackwater pretend that they are enchained in a subterranean prison by order of Lucifer, until they shall be able to render up the soul of Kathleen which escaped from them. End of the Countess Kathleen O'Shea by William Butler Yeats.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of Tom Thumb by Joseph Jacobs. Read by Emily Lieberman from Faith Christian School, April 2007. In the days of the great Prince Arthur, there lived a mighty magician called Merlin, the most learned and skillful enchanter the world has ever seen. This famous magician, who could take any form he pleased, was traveling about as a poor beggar, and being very tired, he stopped at the cottage of a plowman to rest himself and asked for some food. The countryman bade him welcome, and his wife, who was a very good-hearted woman, soon brought him some milk in a wooden bowl and some coarse brown bread on a platter. Merlin was much pleased with the kindness of the plowman and his wife, but he could not help noticing that though everything was neat and comfortable in the cottage, they both seemed to be very unhappy. He therefore asked them why they were so melancholy, and learned that they were miserable because they had no children. The poor woman said, with tears in her eyes, "I should be the happiest creature in the world if I had a son. Although he was no bigger than my husband's thumb, I would be satisfied." Merlin was so amused with the idea of a boy no bigger than a man's thumb that he determined to grant the poor woman's wish. Accordingly, in a short time after, the plowman's wife had a son, who, wonderful to relate, was not a bit bigger than his father's thumb. The Queen of the Fairies, wishing to see the little fellow, came in at the window while the mother was sitting up in the bed admiring him. The Queen kissed the child, and giving it the name of Tom Thumb, sent for some fairies, who dressed her little godson according to her orders. An oak leaf hat he had for his crown, his shirt of web by spiders spun, with jacket wove of thistles down, his trousers were of feathers done. His stockings of apple rind they tie, with eyelash from his mother's eye. His shoes were made of mouse's skin, tanned with the downy hair within. Tom never grew any larger than his father's thumb, which was only of ordinary size. But as he got older, he became very cunning and full of tricks. When he was old enough to play with the boys, and had lost all his own cherry stones, he used to creep into the bags of his playfellows, fill his pockets, and getting out without their noticing him, would again join in the game. One day, however, as he was coming out of a bag of cherry stones, where he had been stealing as usual, the boy to whom it belonged chanced to see him. "Aha, my little Tommy," said the boy, "so I have caught you stealing my cherry stones at last, and you shall be rewarded for your thievish tricks." On saying this, he drew the string tight round his neck and gave the bag such a hearty shake that poor little Tom's legs, thighs, and body were sadly bruised. He roared out with pain and begged to be let out, promising never to steal again. A short time afterwards, his mother was making a batter pudding, and Tom, being very anxious to see how it was made, climbed up to the edge of the bowl. But his foot slipped, and he plumped over head and ears into the batter, without his mother noticing him, who stirred him into the pudding bag and put him in the pot to boil. The batter filled Tom's mouth and prevented him from crying, but on feeling the hot water, he kicked and struggled so much in the pot that his mother thought that the pudding was bewitched, and pulling it out of the pot, she threw it outside the door. A poor tinker who was passing by lifted up the pudding and put it in his budget, and then walked off. As Tom had now got his mouth cleared of batter, he then began to cry out loud, which so frightened the tinker that he flung down the pudding and ran away. The pudding being broke to pieces by the fall, Tom crept out, covered all over with the batter, and walked home. His mother, who was very sorry to see her darling in such a woeful state, put him into a teacup and soon washed off the batter, after which she kissed him and laid him in bed. Soon after the adventure of pudding, Tom's mother went to milk her cow in the meadow, and she took him along with her. As the wind was very high, for fear of being blown away, she tied him to a thistle with a piece of fine thread. The cow soon observed Tom's oak leaf hat, and liking the appearance of it, took poor Tom and the thistle at one mouthful. While the cow was chewing the thistle, Tom was afraid of her great teeth, which threatened to crush him in pieces, and he roared as loud as he could, "Mother, mother!" "Where are you, Tommy, my dear Tommy?" said his mother. "Here, mother," replied he, "in the red cow's mouth." His mother began to cry and wring her hands, but the cow, surprised at the odd noises in her throat, opened her mouth and let Tom drop out. Fortunately, his mother caught him in her apron as he was falling to the ground, or he would have been dreadfully hurt. She then put Tom in her bosom and ran home with him. Tom's father made him a whip of barley straw to drive the cattle with, and having one day gone into the fields, Tom slipped a foot and rolled into the furrow. A raven, which was flying over, picked him up and flew with him over the sea, and there dropped him. A large fish swallowed Tom the moment he fell in the sea, which was soon after caught and bought for the table of King Arthur. When they opened the fish in order to cook it, everyone was astonished to find such a little boy. Tom was quite delighted at being free again. They carried him to the king, who made Tom his dwarf, and he soon began a great favorite at the court. For by his tricks and gambols he not only amused the king and queens, but also all the knights of the Round Table. It is said that when the king rode out on horseback, he often took Tom along with him, and if a shower came on, he used to creep into his majesty's waistcoat pocket, where he slept till the rain was over. King Arthur one day asked Tom about his parents, wishing to know if they were as small as he was, and whether they were well off. Tom told the king that his father and mother were as tall as anybody about the court, but in rather poor circumstances. On hearing this, the king carried him to his treasury, the place where he kept all his money, and told him to take as much money as he could carry home to his parents, which made the poor little fellow caper with joy. Tom went immediately to procure a purse, which was made of a water bottle, and then returned to the treasury, where he received a silver 3-penny piece to put into it. Our little hero had some difficulty in lifting the burden upon his back, but he at last succeeded in getting it placed to his mind, and set forward on his journey. However, without meeting with any accident, and after resting himself more than 100 times by the way, in 2 days and 2 nights he reached his father's house in safety. Tom had traveled 48 hours with a huge silver piece on his back, and was almost tired to death when his mother ran out to meet him and carried him into the house. But he soon returned to court. As Tom's clothes had suffered much in the batter pudding and the inside of the fish, his majesty ordered him a new suit of clothes, and to be mounted as knight on a mouse. Of butterflies' wings his shirt was made, his boots of chicken's hide, and by a nimble fairy blade will learn in the tailoring trade. His clothing was supplies, a needle dangled by his side, a taper mouse he used to ride. Thus strutted Tom in stately pride. It was certainly very diverting to see Tom in this dress and mounted on the mouse as he rode out hunting with the king and nobility, who were all ready to expire with laughter at Tom and his fine prancing charger. The king was so charmed with his address that he ordered a little chair to be made, in order that Tom might sit upon his table, and also a palace of gold, a span high, with a door an inch wide, to live in. He also gave him a coach, drawn by 6 small mice. The queen was so enraged at the honors conferred on Sir Thomas that she resolved to ruin him, and told the king that the little knight had been saucy to her. The king sent for Tom in great haste, but being fully aware of the danger of royal anger, he crept into an empty snail shell, where he lay for a long time until he was almost starved with hunger. But at last he ventured to peep out, and seeing a fine large butterfly on the ground near the place of his concealment, he got close to it, and jumping astride on it, was carried up into the air. The butterfly flew with him from tree to tree and from field to field, and at last returned to the court, where the king and nobility all strove to catch him. But at last poor Tom fell from his seat into a watering pot, in which he was almost drowned. When the queen saw him, she was enraged, and said he should be beheaded, and he was again put into a mouse trap until the time of his execution. However, a cat, observing something alive in the trap, patted it upon until the wires broke, and set Thomas at liberty. The king received Tom again into favor, which he did not live to enjoy, for a large spider one day attacked him, and although he drew his sword and fought well, yet the spider's poisonous breath at last overcame him. He fell dead on the ground where he stood, and the spider sucked every drop of his blood. King Arthur and his whole court were so sorry at the loss of their little favorite that they went into mourning and raised a fine white marble monument over his grave with the following epitaph: "Here lies Tom Thumb, King Arthur's knight, who died by a spider's cruel bite. He was well known in Arthur's court, where he afforded gallant sport. He rode a tilt and tournament, and on a mouse a-hunting went. Alive he filled the court with mirth. His death to sorrow soon gave birth. Wipe your eyes and shake your head, and cry at last, Tom Thumb is dead." End of The History of Tom Thumb by Joseph Jacobs.
John and I by Stephen Leacock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Debra Lynn in Northern Lower Michigan, April 2007. John and I, or How I Nearly Lost My Husband. Narrated after the approved fashion of the best Heart and Home magazines. It was after we had been married about 2 years that I began to feel that I needed more air. Every time I looked at John across the breakfast table, I felt as if I must have more air, more space. I seemed to feel as if I had no room to expand. I had begun to ask myself whether I had been wise in marrying John, whether John was really sufficient for my development. I felt cramped and shut in. In spite of myself, the question would arise in my mind whether John really understood my nature. He had a way of reading the newspaper, propped up against the sugar bowl at breakfast, that somehow made me feel as if things had gone all wrong. It was bitter to realize that the time had come when John could prefer the newspaper to his wife's society. But perhaps I had better go back and tell the whole miserable story from the beginning. I shall never forget, I suppose no woman ever does, the evening when John first spoke out his love for me. I had felt for some time past that it was there. Again and again he seemed about to speak, but somehow his words seemed to fail him. Twice I took him into the very heart of the little wood beside Mother's house, but it was only a small wood, and somehow he slipped out on the other side. "Oh, John," I had said, "how lonely and still it seems in the wood with no one here but ourselves." "Do you think," I said, "that the birds have souls?" "I don't know," John answered. "Let's get out of this." I was sure that his emotion was too strong for him. "I never feel a bit lonesome where you are, John," I said, as we made our way among the underbrush. "I think we can get out down that little gully," he answered. Then one evening in June, after tea, I led John down a path beside the house to a little corner behind the garden, where there was a stone wall on one side and a high fence right in front of us, and thorn bushes on the other side. There was a little bench in the angle of the wall and the fence, and we sat down on it. "Minnie," John said, "there's something I meant to say." "Oh, John!" I cried, and I flung my arms round his neck. It all came with such a flood of surprise. "All I meant, John went on, but I checked him. "Oh, don't, John, don't say anything more," I said. "It's just too perfect." Then I rose and seized him by the wrist. "Come," I said, "come to Mother," and I rushed him along the path. As soon as Mother saw us come hand in hand in this way, she guessed everything. She threw both her arms round John's neck and fairly pinned him against the wall. John tried to speak, but Mother wouldn't let him. "I saw it all along, John," she said. "Don't speak, don't say a word. I guessed your love for Min from the very start. I don't know what I shall do without her, John, but she's yours now. Take her." Then Mother began to cry, and I couldn't help crying too. "Take him to Father," Mother said. And we each took one of John's wrists and took him to Father on the back veranda. As soon as John saw Father, he tried to speak again. "I think I ought to say," he began, but Mother stopped him. "Father," she said, "he wants to take our little girl away. He loves her very dearly, Alfred," she said, "and I think it our duty to let her go, no matter how hard it is. And oh, please Heaven, Alfred, he'll treat her well and not misuse her or beat her." And she began to sob again. Father got up and took John by the hand and shook it warmly. "Take her, boy," he said. "She's all yours now. Take her." So John and I were engaged, and in due time our wedding day came and we were married. I remember that for days and days before the wedding day, John seemed very nervous and depressed. I think he was worrying, poor boy, as to whether he could really make me happy, and whether he could fill my life as it should be filled. But I told him that he was not to worry because I meant to be happy and was determined just to make the best of everything. Father stayed with John a good deal before the wedding day, and on the wedding morning he went and fetched him to the church in a closed carriage and had him there all ready when we came. It was a beautiful day in September, and the church looked just lovely. I had a beautiful gown of white organdy with tulle at the throat, and I carried a great bunch of white roses, and Father led John up the aisle after me. I remember that Mother cried a good deal at the wedding, and told John that he had stolen her darling, and that he must never misuse me or beat me. And I remember that the clergyman spoke very severely to John, and told him he hoped he realized the responsibility he was taking, and that it was his duty to make me happy. A lot of our old friends were there, and they all spoke quite sharply to John, and all the women kissed me and said they hoped I would never regret what I had done, and I just kept up my spirits by sheer determination, and told them that I had made up my mind to be happy, and that I was going to be so. So presently it was all over, and we were driven to the station and got the afternoon train for New York. And when we sat down in the compartment among all our bandboxes and flowers, John said, "Well, thank God that's over." And I said, "Oh, John, an oath! On our wedding day, an oath!" John said, "I'm sorry, Min, I didn't mean—" But I said, "Don't, John, don't make it worse. Swear at me if you must, but don't make it harder to bear." We spent our honeymoon in New York. At first I had thought of going somewhere to the great lonely woods where I could have walked under the great trees and felt the silence of nature, and where John should have been my Viking and captured me with his spear, and where I should be his and his alone, and no other man should share me. And John had said all right. Or else I had planned to go away somewhere to the seashore, where I could have watched the great waves dashing themselves against the rocks. I had told John that he should be my caveman, and should seize me in his arms and carry me whither he would. I felt somehow that for my development I wanted to get as close to nature as ever I could, that my mind seemed to be reaching out for a great emptiness. But I looked over all the hotel and steamship folders I could find, and it seemed impossible to get good accommodation. So we came to New York. I had a great deal of shopping to do for our new house, so I could not be much with John, but I felt it was not right to neglect him. So I drove him somewhere in a taxi each morning, and called for him again in the evening. One day I took him to the Metropolitan Museum, and another day I left him at the zoo, and another day at the aquarium. John seemed very happy and quiet among the fishes. So presently we came back home, and I spent many busy days in fixing and arranging our new house. I had the drawing room done in blue, and the dining room all in dark panelled wood, and the boudoir upstairs done in pink and white enamel to match my bedroom and dressing room. There was a very nice little room in the basement next to the coal cellar that I turned into a den for John, so that when he wanted to smoke he could go down there and do it. John seemed to appreciate his den at once, and often would stay down there so long that I had to call to him to come up. When I look back on those days they seem very bright and happy, but it was not very long before a change came. I began to realize that John was neglecting me. I noticed it at first in small things. I don't know just how long it was after our marriage that John began to read the newspaper at breakfast. At first he would only pick it up and read it in little bits, and only on the front page. I tried not to be hurt at it, and would go on talking just as brightly as I could without seeming to notice anything. But presently he went on to reading the inside part of the paper, and then one day he opened up the financial page and folded the paper right back and leant it against the sugar bowl. I could not but wonder whether John's love for me was what it had been. Was it cooling, I asked myself, and what was cooling it? It hardly seemed possible, when I looked back to the wild passion with which he had proposed to me on the garden bench, that John's love was waning. But I kept noticing different little things. One day in the springtime I saw John getting out a lot of fishing tackle from a box and fitting it together. I asked him what he was going to do, and he said that he was going to fish. I went to my room and had a good cry. It seemed dreadful that he could neglect his wife for a few worthless fish. So I decided to put John to the test. It had been my habit every morning after he put his coat on to go to the office to let John have one kiss, just one weeny kiss to keep him happy all day. So this day when he was getting ready I bent my head over a big bowl of flowers and pretended not to notice. I think John must have been hurt as I heard him steal out on tiptoe. Well, I realized that things had come to a dreadful state, and so I sent over to Mother, and Mother came, and we had a good cry together. I made up my mind to force myself to face things, and just to be as bright as ever I could. Mother and I both thought that things would be better if I tried all I could to make something out of John. I have always felt that every woman should make all that she can out of her husband. So I did my best, first of all, to straighten up John's appearance. I shifted the style of collar he was wearing to a tighter kind that I liked better, and I brushed his hair straight backward instead of forward, which gave him a much more alert look. Mother said that John needed waking up, and so we did all we could to wake him up. Mother came over to stay with me a good deal, and in the evenings we generally had a little music or a game of cards. About this time another difficulty began to come into my married life, which I suppose I ought to have foreseen. I mean the attentions of other gentlemen. I have always called forth a great deal of admiration in gentlemen, but I have always done my best to act like a lady and to discourage it in every possible way. I had been innocent enough to suppose that this would end with married life, and it gave me a dreadful shock to realize that such was not the case. The first one I noticed was a young man who came to the house at an hour when John was out, for the purpose, so he said at least, of reading the gas meter. He looked at me in just the boldest way and asked me to show him the way to the cellar. I don't know whether it was a pretext or not, but I just summoned all the courage I had and showed him to the head of the cellar stairs. I had determined that if he tried to carry me down with him I would scream for the servants, but I suppose something in my manner made him desist, and he went alone. When he came up he professed to have read the meter, and he left the house quite quietly. But I thought it wiser to say nothing to John of what had happened. There were others too. There was a young man with large brown eyes who came and said he had been sent to tune the piano. He came on 3 separate days, and he bent his ear over the keys in such a mournful way that I knew he must have fallen in love with me. On the last day he offered to tune my harp for $1 extra, but I refused, and when I asked him instead to tune Mother's mandolin, he said he didn't know how. Of course I told John nothing of all this. Then there was Mr. McQueen, who came to the house several times to play cribbage with John. He had been desperately in love with me years before. At least I remember his taking me home from a hockey match once, and what a struggle it was for him not to come into the parlour and see Mother for a few minutes when I asked him. And though he was married now and with 3 children, I felt sure when he came to play cribbage with John that it meant something. He was very discreet and honourable, and never betrayed himself for a moment, and I acted my part as if there was nothing at all behind. But one night when he came over to play, and John had to go out, he refused to stay, even for an instant. He had got his overshoes off before I told him that John was out, and asked him if he wouldn't come into the parlour and hear Mother play the mandolin. But he just made one dive for his overshoes and was gone. I knew that he didn't dare to trust himself. Then presently a new trouble came. I began to suspect that John was drinking. I don't mean for a moment that he was drunk, or that he was openly cruel to me, but at times he seemed to act so queerly, and I noticed that one night when by accident I left a bottle of raspberry vinegar on the sideboard overnight, it was all gone in the morning. 2 or 3 times when McQueen and John were to play cribbage, John would fetch home 2 or 3 bottles of bevo with him, and they would sit sipping all evening. I think he was drinking bevo by himself, too, though I could never be sure of it. At any rate, he often seemed queer and restless in the evenings, and instead of staying in his den, he would wander all over the house. Once we heard him, I mean Mother and I and 2 lady friends who were with us that evening, quite late, after 10 o'clock, apparently moving about in the pantry. "John," I called, "is that you?" "Yes, Min," he answered, quietly enough, I admit. "What are you doing there?" I asked. "Looking for something to eat," he said. "John," I said, "you are forgetting what is due to me as your wife. You were fed at 6. Go back." He went, but yet I felt more and more that his love must be dwindling to make him act as he did. I thought it all over wearily enough, and asked myself whether I had done everything I should to hold my husband's love. I had kept him in at nights, I had cut down his smoking, I had stopped his playing cards. What more was there that I could do? So at last the conviction came to me that I must go away. I felt that I must get away somewhere and think things out. At first I thought of Palm Beach, but the season had not opened, and I felt somehow that I couldn't wait. I wanted to get away somewhere by myself and just face things as they were. So one morning I said to John, "John, I think I'd like to go off somewhere for a little time, just to be by myself, dear. And I don't want you to ask to come with me or to follow me, but just let me go." John said, "All right, Min, when are you going to start?" The cold brutality of it cut me to the heart, and I went upstairs and had a good cry and looked over steamship and railroad folders. I thought of Havana for a while, because the pictures of the harbor and the castle and the queer Spanish streets looked so attractive. But then I was afraid that at Havana a woman alone by herself might be simply persecuted by attentions from gentlemen. They say the Spanish temperament is something fearful. So I decided on Bermuda instead. I felt that in a beautiful, quiet place like Bermuda I could think everything all over and face things. And it said on the folder that there were always at least 2 English regiments in garrison there, and the English officers, whatever their faults, always treat a woman with the deepest respect. So I said nothing more to John, but in the next few days I got all my arrangements made and my things packed. And when the last afternoon came, I sat down and wrote John a long letter to leave on my boudoir table, telling him that I had gone to Bermuda. I told him that I wanted to be alone. I said that I couldn't tell when I would be back, that it might be months or it might be years, and I hoped that he would try to be as happy as he could and forget me entirely, and to send me money on the 1st of every month. Well, it was just at that moment that one of those strange coincidences happened, little things in themselves, but which seem to alter the whole course of a person's life. I had nearly finished the letter to John that I was to leave on the writing desk, when just then the maid came up to my room with a telegram. It was for John, but I thought it my duty to open it and read it for him before I left. and I nearly fainted when I saw that it was from a lawyer in Bermuda, of all places, and it said that a legacy of $200,000 had been left to John by an uncle of his who had died there, and asking for instructions about the disposition of it. A great wave seemed to sweep over me, and all the wicked thoughts that had been in my mind, for I saw now that they were wicked, were driven clean away. I thought how completely lost poor old John would feel if all this money came to him and he didn't have to work any more, and had no one at his side to help and guide him in using it. I tore up the wicked letter I had written, and I hurried as fast as I could to pack up a valise with John's things. My own were packed already, as I said. Then presently John came in, and I broke the news to him as gently and as tenderly as I could about his uncle having left him the money and having died. I told him that I had found out all about the trains and the Bermuda steamer, and had everything all packed and ready for us to leave at once. John seemed a little dazed about it all, and kept saying that his uncle had taught him to play tennis when he was a little boy, and he was very grateful and thankful to me for having everything arranged, and thought it wonderful. I had time to telephone to a few of my women friends, and they just managed to rush round for a few minutes to say good-bye. I couldn't help crying a little when I told them about John's uncle dying so far away with none of us near him, and I told them about the legacy, and they cried a little to hear of it all. And when I told them that John and I might not come back direct from Bermuda, but might take a run over to Europe first, they all cried some more. We left for New York that evening, and after we had been to Bermuda and arranged about a suitable monument for John's uncle, and collected the money, we sailed for Europe. All through the happy time that has followed, I like to think that through all our trials and difficulties, affliction brought us safely together at last. End of John and I, by Stephen Leacock.
The Philosopher in the Apple Orchard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Philosopher in the Apple Orchard by Anthony Hope. It was a charmingly mild and balmy day. The sun shone beyond the orchard, and the shade was cool inside. A light breeze stirred the boughs of the old apple tree under which the philosopher sat. None of these things did the philosopher notice, unless it might be when the wind blew about the leaves of the large volume on his knees, and he had to find his place again. Then he would exclaim against the wind, shuffle the leaves till he got the right page, and settle to his reading. The book was a treatise on ontology. It was written by another philosopher, a friend of this philosopher's. It bristled with fallacies, and this philosopher was discovering them all, and noting them on the fly-leaf at the end. He was not going to review the book, as some might have thought from his behaviour, or even answer it in a work of his own. It was just that he found a pleasure in stripping any poor fallacy naked and crucifying it. Presently a girl in a white frock came into the orchard. She picked up an apple, bit it, and found it ripe. Holding it in her hand, she walked up to where the philosopher sat, and looked at him. He did not stir. She took a bite out of the apple, munched it, and swallowed it. The philosopher crucified a fallacy on the fly-leaf. The girl flung the apple away. "Mr. Jerningham," said she, "are you very busy?" The philosopher, pencil in hand, looked up. "No, Miss May," said he, "not very." "Because I want your opinion." "In one moment," said the philosopher, apologetically. He turned back to the fly-leaf and began to nail the last fallacy a little tighter to the cross. The girl regarded him, first with amused impatience, then with a vexed frown, finally with a wistful regret. He was so very old for his age, she thought. He could not be much beyond 30. His hair was thick and full of waves, his eyes bright and clear, his complexion not yet divested of all youth's relics. "Now, Miss May, I'm at your service," said the philosopher, with a lingering look at his impaled fallacy, and he closed the book, keeping it, however, on his knee. The girl sat down just opposite to him. "It's a very important thing I want to ask you," she began, tugging at a tuft of grass, "and it's very difficult, and you mustn't tell anyone I asked you. At least, I'd rather you didn't." "I shall not speak of it. Indeed, I shall probably not remember it," said the philosopher. "And you mustn't look at me, please, while I'm asking you." "I don't think I was looking at you, but if I was I beg your pardon," said the philosopher, apologetically. She pulled the tuft of grass right out of the ground, and flung it from her with all her force. "Suppose a man," she began. "No, that's not right." "You can take any hypothesis you please," observed the philosopher, "but you must verify it afterward, of course." "Oh, do let me go on. Suppose a girl, Mr. Jerningham, I wish you wouldn't nod. It was only to show that I followed you." "Oh, of course you follow me, as you call it. Suppose a girl had two lovers. You're nodding again. Or, I ought to say, suppose there were two men who might be in love with a girl." "Only two?" asked the philosopher. "You see, any number of men might be in love with—" "Oh, we can leave the rest out," said Miss May, with a sudden dimple. "They don't matter." "Very well," said the philosopher. "If they are irrelevant, we will put them aside. Suppose, then, that one of these men was, awfully in love with the girl, and proposed, you know." "A moment," said the philosopher, opening a notebook. "Let me take down his proposition. What was it?" "Why, proposed to her. Asked her to marry him," said the girl, with a stare. "Dear me, how stupid of me. I forgot that special use of the word. Yes. The girl likes him pretty well, and her people approve of him, and all that, you know." "That simplifies the problem," said the philosopher, nodding again. "But she's not in love with him, you know. She doesn't really care for him much. Do you understand?" "Perfectly. It is a most natural state of mind." "Well then, suppose that there's another man. What are you writing?" "I only put down B, like that," pleaded the philosopher, meekly exhibiting his notebook. She looked at him in a sort of helpless exasperation, with just a smile somewhere in the background of it. "Oh, you really are!" she exclaimed. "But let me go on. The other man is a friend of the girl's. He's very clever, oh, fearfully clever, and he's rather handsome. You needn't put that down." "It is certainly not very material," admitted the philosopher, and he crossed out handsome. Clever he left. "And the girl is most awfully. She admires him tremendously. She thinks him just the greatest man that ever lived, you know, and she the girl paused. "I'm following," said the philosopher, with pencil poised. "She'd think it better than the whole world if she could be anything to him, you know." "You mean become his wife?" "Well, of course I do. At least, I suppose I do." "You spoke rather vaguely, you know." The girl cast one glance at the philosopher as she replied, "Well, yes, I did mean become his wife." "Yes, well?" "But," continued the girl, starting on another tuft of grass, "he doesn't think much about those things. He likes her, I think he likes her." "Well, doesn't dislike her," suggested the philosopher. "Shall we call him indifferent?" "I don't know. Yes, rather indifferent. I don't think he thinks about it, you know, that she's pretty. You needn't put that down." "I was not about to do so," observed the philosopher. "She thinks life with him would be just heaven, and she thinks she would make him awfully happy. She would be so proud of him, you see." "I see. Yes. And I don't know how to put it, quite. She thinks that if he ever thought about it at all he might care for her, because he doesn't care for anybody else, and she's pretty." "You said that before." "Oh dear, I dare say I did. And most men care for somebody, don't they? Some girl, I mean." "Most men, no doubt," conceded the philosopher. "Well then, what ought she to do? It's not a real thing, you know, Mr. Jerningham. It's in a novel I was reading." She said this hastily, and blushed as she spoke. "Dear me! And it's quite an interesting case." "Yes, I see. The question is, will she act most wisely in accepting the offer of the man who loves her exceedingly, but for whom she entertains only a moderate affection?" "Yes, just a liking. He's just a friend." "Exactly. Or in marrying the other whom she loves, X." "That's not it. How can she marry him? He hasn't asked her, you see." "True, I forgot. Let us assume, though, for the moment, that he has asked her. She would then have to consider which marriage would probably be productive of the greater sum total of—" "Oh, but you needn't consider that." "But it seems the best logical order. We can afterward make allowance for the element of uncertainty caused by—" "Oh no, I don't want it like that. I know perfectly well which she'd do if the other man, you know, asked her." "You apprehend that?" "Never mind what I apprehend. Take it as I told you." "Very good. A has asked her hand. B has not." "Yes." "May I take it that, but for the disturbing influence of B, A would be a satisfactory candidate?" Yes, I think so." "She therefore enjoys a certainty of considerable happiness if she marries A?" "Yes, not perfect, because of B, you know." "Quite so, quite so. But still a fair amount of happiness, is it not so?" "I don't well, perhaps." "On the other hand, if B did ask her, we are to postulate a higher degree of happiness for her?" "Yes, please, Mr. Jerningham, much higher." "For both of them?" "For her. Never mind him." "Very well, that again simplifies the problem. But his asking her is a contingency only?" "Yes, that's all." The philosopher spread out his hands. "My dear young lady," he said, "it becomes a question of degree. How probable or improbable is it?" "I don't know. Not very probable, unless—" "Well?" "Unless he did happen to notice, you know." "Ah, yes, we suppose that. If he thought of it, he would probably take the desired step, at least, that he might be led to do so. Could she not indicate her preference?" "She might try. No, she couldn't do much. You see, he doesn't think about such things." "I understand precisely, and it seems to me, Miss May, that in that very fact we find our solution." "Do we?" she asked. "I think so. He has evidently no natural inclination toward her, perhaps not toward marriage at all. Any feeling aroused in him would be necessarily shallow and in a measure, artificial, and in all likelihood purely temporary. Moreover, if she took steps to arouse his attention, one of two things would be likely to happen. Are you following me?" "Yes, Mr. Jerningham." "Either he would be repelled by her overtures, which you must admit is not improbable, and then the position would be unpleasant, and even degrading, for her, or, on the other hand, he might, through a misplaced feeling of gallantry—" "Through what?" "Through a mistaken idea of politeness, or a mistaken view of what was kind, allow himself to be drawn into a connection for which he had no genuine liking. You agree with me that one or other of these things would be likely?" "Yes, I suppose they would, unless he did come to care for her." "Ah, you return to that hypothesis." "I think it's an extremely fanciful one. No, she need not marry but she must let be alone." The philosopher closed his book, took off his glasses, wiped them, replaced them, and leaned back against the trunk of the apple tree. The girl picked a dandelion in pieces. After a long pause she asked, "You think B's feelings wouldn't be at all likely to change?" "That depends on the sort of man he is. But if he is an able man, with intellectual interest which engross him, a man who has chosen his path in life, a man to whom women's society is not a necessity—" "He's just like that," said the girl, and she bit the head off a daisy. "Then," said the philosopher, "I see not the least reason for supposing that his feelings will change." "And would you advise her to marry the other, "Well, on the whole, I should. Is a good fellow. I think we made a good fellow. He is a suitable match. His love for her is true and genuine." "It's tremendous." "Yes, and extreme. She likes him. There is every reason to hope that her liking will develop into a sufficiently deep and stable affection. She will get rid of her folly about B, and make a good wife. Yes, Miss May, if I were the author of your novel I should make her marry A, and I should call that a happy ending." A silence followed. It was broken by the philosopher. "Is that all you wanted my opinion about, Miss May?" he asked, with his finger between the leaves of the treatise on ontology. "Yes, I think so. I hope I haven't bored you." "I've enjoyed the discussion extremely. I have no idea that novels raise points of such psychological interest. I must find time to read one." The girl had shifted her position till, instead of her full face, her profile was turned toward him, looking away toward the paddock that lay brilliant in sunshine on the skirts of the apple orchard. She asked in a low, slow tones, twisting her hands in her lap, "Don't you think that perhaps if B found out afterward, when she had married A, you know, that she had cared for him so very, very much, he might be a little sorry?" "If he were a gentleman he would regret it deeply." "I mean sorry on his own account, that he had thrown away all that, you know." The philosopher looked meditative. "I think," he pronounced, "that it is very possible he would. I can well imagine it." "He might never find anybody to love him like that again," she said, gazing on the gleaming paddock. "He probably would not," agreed the philosopher. And most people like being loved, don't they?" "To crave for love is an almost universal instinct, Miss May." "Yes, almost," she said, with a dreary little smile. "You see, He'll get old and have no one to look after him." "He will." "And no home." "Well, in a sense, none," corrected the philosopher, smiling. "But really you'll frighten me. I'm a bachelor myself, you know, Miss May." "Yes," she whispered, just audibly, "and all your terrors are before me." "Well, unless—" "Oh, we needn't have that 'unless,'" laughed the philosopher, cheerfully. "There's no 'unless' about it, Miss May." The girl jumped to her feet. For an instant she looked at the philosopher. She opened her lips as if to speak, and at the thought of what lay at her tongue's tip her face grew red. But the philosopher was gazing past her, and his eyes rested in calm contemplation on the gleaming paddock. "A beautiful thing, Sunshine, to be sure," said he. Her blush faded away into paleness. Her lips closed. Without speaking she turned and walked slowly away, her head drooping. The philosopher heard the rustle of her skirt in the long grass of the orchard. He watched her for a few moments. "A pretty graceful creature," said he, with a smile. Then he opened his book, took his pencil in his hand, and slipped in a careful forefinger to mark the fly leaf. The sun had passed mid-heaven and began to decline westward before he finished the book. Then he stretched himself and looked at his watch. "Good gracious, 2 o'clock! I shall be late for lunch," and he hurried to his feet. He was very late for lunch. "Everything's cold," wailed his hostess. "Where have you been, Mr. Jerningham?" "Only in the orchard reading." "And you've missed May?" Miss May? How do you mean? I had a long talk with her this morning, a most interesting talk." "But you weren't here to say good bye. Now you don't mean to say that you forgot that she was leaving by the 2 o'clock train?" "What a man you are!" "Dear me, to think of my forgetting it," said the philosopher, shamefacedly. "She told me to say good bye to you for her." "She's very kind. I can't forgive myself." His hostess looked at him for a moment. Then she sighed and smiled and sighed again. "Have you everything you want?" she asked. "Everything, thank you," said he, sitting down opposite the cheese, and propping his book. He thought he would just run through the last chapter again, against the loaf. "Everything in the world that I want, thanks." His hostess did not tell him that the girl had come in from the apple orchard and run hastily upstairs, lest her friend should see what her friend did see in her eyes, so that he had no suspicion at all that he had received an offer of marriage, and refused it. And he did not refer to anything of that sort when he paused once in his reading and exclaimed, "I'm really sorry I missed Miss May. That was an interesting case of hers, but I have the right answer. The girl ought to marry A." And so the girl did. End of story.
The School Mistress by Anton Chekhov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. At 8:30 they drove out of the town. The high road was dry. A lovely April sun was shining warmly, but the snow was still lying in the ditches and in the woods. Winter, dark, long, and spiteful, was hardly over. Spring had come all of a sudden, but neither the warmth nor the languid, transparent woods, warmed by the breath of spring, nor the black flocks of birds flying over the huge puddles that were like lakes, nor the marvelous, fathomless sky, into which it seemed one would have gone away so joyfully, presented anything new or interesting. Marya Vassilievna, who was sitting in the cart. For 13 years she had been schoolmistress, and there was no reckoning how many times during all those years she had been to town for her salary, and whether it were spring as now, or a rainy autumn evening, or winter, it was all the same to her, and she always, invariably, longed for one thing only, to get to the end of her journey as quickly as could be. She felt as though she had been living in that part of the country for ages and ages, for 100 years, and it seemed to her that she knew every stone, every tree on the road from the town to her school. Her past was here, her present was here, and she could imagine no other future than the school, the road to the town and back again the school, and again the road. She had got out of the habit of thinking of her past before she became schoolmistress, and had almost forgotten it. She had once had a father and mother. They had lived in Moscow in a big flat near the Red Gate, but all of her life there was left in her memory only something vague and fluid like a dream. Her father had died when she was 10 years old, and her mother had died soon after. She had a brother, an officer. At first they used to write to each other. Then her brother had given up answering her letters. He had got out of the way of writing. Of her old belongings, all that was left was a photograph of her mother, but it had grown dim from the dampness of the school, and now nothing could be seen but the hair and the eyebrows. When they had driven a couple of miles, old Semyonov, who was driving, turned round and said, "They have caught a government clerk in the town. They have taken him away. The story is that with some Germans he killed Alexeyev, the mayor in Moscow." "Who told you that?" "They were reading it in the paper in Ivan Yanov's tavern." And again they were silent for a long time. Marya Vassilyevna thought of her school, of the examination that was coming soon, and of the girl and 4 boys she was sending up for it. And just as she was thinking about the examination, she was overtaken by a neighboring landowner called Hanov in a carriage with 4 horses, the very man who had been examiner in her school the year before. When he came up to her, he recognized her and bowed. "Good morning," he said to her. "You are driving home, I suppose?" This Hanov, a man of 40, with a listless expression and a face that showed signs of wear, was beginning to look old, but was still handsome and admired by women. He lived in his big homestead alone, and was not in the service, and people used to say of him that he did nothing at home but walk up and down the room whistling, or play chess with his old footman. People said, too, that he drank heavily, and indeed at the examination the year before the very papers he brought with him smelt of wine and scent. He had been dressed all in new clothes on that occasion, and Marya Vassilyevna thought him very attractive, and all the while she sat beside him she had felt embarrassed. She was accustomed to see frigid and sensible examiners at the school, while this one did not remember a single prayer or know what to ask questions about, and was exceedingly courteous and delicate, giving nothing but the highest marks. "I am going to visit Bakvist," he went on, addressing Marya Vassilyevna, "but I am told he is not at home." They turned off the high road into a by road to the village, Hanov leading the way and Semyon following. The 4 horses moved at a walking pace, with effort dragging the heavy carriage through the mud. Semyon tracked from side to side, keeping to the edge of the road, at one time through a snowdrift, at another through a pool, often jumping out of the cart and helping the horse. Marya Vassilyevna was still thinking about the school, wondering whether the arithmetic question at the examination would be difficult or easy, and she felt annoyed with the Zemstov board at which she had found no one the day before. How unbusinesslike! Here she had been asking them for the last 2 years to dismiss the watchman, who did nothing, was rude to her, and hit the schoolboys, but no one paid any attention. It was hard to find the president at the office, and when one did find him, he would say, with tears in his eyes, that he hadn't a moment to spare. The inspector visited the school at most once in 3 years, and knew nothing whatever about his work, as he had been in the excise duties department and had received the post of school inspector through influence. The school council met very rarely, and there was no knowing where it met. The school guardian was an almost illiterate peasant, the head of a tanning business, unintelligent, rude, and a great friend of the watchman's, and goodness knows to whom she could appeal with complaints or inquiries. He really is handsome, she thought, glancing at Hanov. The road grew worse and worse. They drove into the wood. Here there was no room to turn around. The wheels sank deeply in. Water splashed and gurgled through them, and sharp twigs struck them in the face. "What a road," said Hanov, and he laughed. The schoolmistress looked at him and could not understand why this queer man lived here. What could his money, his interesting appearance, his refined bearing do for him here in this mud, in this God-forsaken, dreary place? He got no special advantages out of life here, like Semyon was driving at a jog-trot on an appalling road and enduring the same discomforts. Why live here if one could live in Petersburg or abroad? And one would have thought it would be nothing for a rich man like him to make a good road instead of this bad one, to avoid enduring this misery and seeing the despair on the faces of his coachman and Semyon. But he only laughed and apparently did not mind, and wanted no better life. He was kind, soft, naive, and he did not understand this coarse life. Just as at the examination he did not know the prayers. He subscribed nothing to the schools but globes, and genuinely regarded himself as a useful person and a prominent worker in the cause of popular education. And what use were his globes here? "Hold on, Vasilyev," said Semyon. The cart lurched violently and was on the point of upsetting. Something heavy rolled onto Marya Vasilyeva's feet. It was her parcel of purchases. There was a steep ascent uphill through the clay. Here in the winding ditches rivulets were gurgling. The water seemed to have gnawed away the road, and how could one get along here? The horses breathed hard. Hanov got out of his carriage and walked at the side of the road in his long overcoat. He was hot. "What a road," he said, and laughed again. "It would soon smash up one's carriage." "Nobody obliges you to drive about in such weather," said Semyon surly. "You should stay at home." "I am dull at home, grandfather. I don't like staying at home." Beside old Semyon he looked graceful and vigorous, but yet in his walk there was something just perceptible which betrayed in him a being already touched by decay, weak and on the road to ruin. And all at once there was a whiff of spirits in the wood. Marya Vasilyeva was filled with dread and pity for this man going to his ruin for no visible cause or reason. It came into her mind that if she had been his wife or sister, she would have devoted her whole life to saving him from ruin. His wife! Life was so ordered that here he was living in his great house alone, and she was living in a God-forsaken village alone, and yet for some reason the mere thought that he and she might be close to one another and equals seemed impossible and absurd. In reality, life was arranged and human relations were complicated so utterly beyond all understanding that when one thought about it, one felt uncanny and one's heart sunk. And it is beyond all understanding, she thought, why God gives beauty, this graciousness, and sad, sweet eyes to weak, unlucky, useless people, why they are so charming. "Here we must turn off the road," said Hanov, getting into his carriage. "Good-bye. I wish you all good things." And again she thought of her pupils, of the examination, of the watchman, of the school council, and when the wind brought the sound of the retreating carriage, these thoughts were mingled with others. She longed to think of beautiful eyes, of love, of the happiness which would never be. His wife! It was cold in the morning. There was no one to heat the stove. The watchman disappeared. The children came in as soon as it was light, bringing in snow and mud and making a noise. It was all so inconvenient, so comfortless. Her abode consisted of one little room and the kitchen close by. Her head ached every day after her work, and after dinner she had heartburn. She had to collect money from the school children for wood and for the watchman, and to give it to the school guardian, and then to entreat him, that overfed, insolent peasant, for God's sake to send her wood. And at night she dreamed of examinations, peasants, snowdrifts, and this life was making her grow old and coarse, making her ugly, angular, and awkward, as though she were made of lead. She was always afraid, and she would get up from her seat and not venture to sit down in the presence of a member of the Zemstov or the school guardian, and she used formal, deferential expressions when she spoke to any one of them, and no one thought her attractive, and life was passing drearily, without affection, without friendly sympathy, without interesting acquaintances. How awful it would have been in her position if she had fallen in love! "Hold on, Vassilievna." Again a sharp ascent uphill. She had become a schoolmistress from necessity, without feeling any vocation for it, and she had never thought of a vocation, of serving the cause of enlightenment, and it always seemed to her that what was most important in her work was not the children, nor enlightenment, but the examinations. And what time had she for thinking of vocations, or serving the cause of enlightenment? Teachers, badly paid doctors, and their assistants, with their terribly hard work, have not even the comfort of thinking that they are serving an idea or the people, as their heads are always stuffed with thoughts of their daily bread, of wood for the fire, of bad roads, of illnesses. It is a hard-working, an uninteresting life, and only silent, like Marya Vassilievna, could put up with it for long. The lively, nervous, impressionable people who talked about vocation and serving the idea were soon weary of it and gave up the work. Semyon kept picking out the driest, shortest way, first by a meadow, then by the backs of the village huts. But in one place the peasants would not let him pass. In another it was the priest's land, and they could not cross it. In another Ivan Ivanov had bought a plot from the landowner and had dug a ditch around it. They kept having to turn back. They reached Nizhny Gordoshtish, near the tavern on the dung-strewn earth where the snow was still lying. There stood wagons that had brought great bottles of crude sulphuric acid. There were a great many people in the tavern, all drivers, and there was a smell of vodka, tobacco, and sheepskins. There was a loud noise of conversation and the banging of the swinging door. Through the wall, without ceasing for a moment, came the sound of a concertina being played in the shop. Marya Vassilievna sat down and drank some tea, while at the next table peasants were drinking vodka and beer, perspiring from the tea they had just swallowed and the stifling fumes of the tavern. "I say, Kuzma," voices kept shouting in confusion. "What there? The Lord bless us! Ivan Dmitrievitch, I can tell you that. Look out, old man." A little pock-marked man with a black beard, who was quite drunk, was suddenly surprised by something, and began using bad language. "What are you swearing at, you there?" Semyon, who was sitting some way off, responded angrily. "Don't you see the young lady?" "The young lady," someone mimicked in another corner. "Swinish crow." "We meant nothing," said the little man in confusion. "I beg your pardon. We pay with our money, and the young lady with hers. Good morning." "Good morning," answered the schoolmistress, "and we thank you most feelingly." Marya Vassilievna drank her tea with satisfaction, and she too began turning red like the peasants, and fell to thinking again about firewood, about the watchman. "Stay, old man," she heard from the next table. "It's the schoolmistress from Vaznenovye. We know her. She's a good young lady. She's all right." The swinging door was continually banging, some coming in, others going out. Marya Vassilievna sat on, thinking all the time of the same things, while the concertina went on playing and playing. The patches of sunshine had been on the floor. Then they passed to the counter, to the wall, and disappeared altogether. So by the sun it was past midday. The peasants at the next table were getting ready to go. The little man, somewhat unsteadily, went up to Marya Vassilievna and held out his hand to her. Following his example, the others shook hands, too, at parting, and went out one after another, and the swinging door squeaked and slammed 9 times. "Vassilievna, get ready," Semyon called to her. They set off, and again they went at a walking pace. "A little while back they were building a school here in their Nizhny Gordoshtish," said Semyon, turning around. "It was a wicked thing that was done." "Why, what?" "They say the president put 1,000 in his pocket, and the school guardian another 1,000 in his, and the teacher 500. The whole school cost only 1,000. It's wrong to slander people, grandfather. That's all nonsense." "I don't know. I only tell you what folks say." But it was clear that Semyon did not believe the schoolmistress. The peasants did not believe her. They always thought she received too large a salary. 21 roubles a month. 5 would have been enough. And that of the money that she collected from the children for the firewood and the watchman, the greater part she kept for herself. The guardian thought the same as the peasants, and he himself made a profit off the firewood and received payments from the peasants for being a guardian without the knowledge of the authorities. The forest, thank God, was beyond them, and now it would be flat, open ground all the way to Vyaznyov. And there was not far to go. They had to cross a river and then the railway line, and then Vyaznyov was in sight. "Where are you driving?" Marya Vassilyevna asked Semyon. "Take the road to the right to the bridge." "Why, we can go this way as well. It's not deep enough to matter. Mind you don't drown the horse." "What? Look, Hanov is driving to the bridge," said Marya Vassilyevna, seeing the 4 horses far away to the right. "It is he, I think." "It is. So he didn't find Baskovich at home. What a pig-headed fellow he is! Lord have mercy upon us. He's driven over there, and what for? It's fully 2 miles nearer this way." They reached the river. In the summer it was a little stream, easily crossed by wading. It usually dried up in August, but now, after the spring floods, it was a river 40 feet in breadth, rapid, muddy, and cold. On the bank and right up to the water there were fresh tracks of wheels, so it had been crossed here. "Go on!" shouted Semyon angrily and anxiously, tugging violently at the reins and jerking his elbows as a bird does its wings. "Go on!" The horse went on into the water up to its belly and stopped, but at once went on again with effort, and Marya Vassilyevna was aware of a keen chillness in her feet. "Go on!" she, too, shouted, getting up. "Go on!" They got out on the bank. "Nice mess it is, Lord have mercy on us," muttered Semyon, setting straight the harness. "It's a perfect plague with this Zemstvo." Her shoes and galoshes were full of water. The lower part of her dress and of her coat and one sleeve were wet and dripping. The sugar and flour had got wet, and that was the worst of all, and Marya Vassilyevna could only clasp her hands in despair and say, "Oh, Semyon, Semyon, how tiresome you are, really." The barrier was down at the railway crossing. A train was coming out at the station. Marya Vassilyevna stood at the crossing, waiting till it should pass, and shivering all over with cold. Vyaznyov was in sight now, and the school with the green roof, and the church with its crosses flashing in the evening sun, and the station windows flashed too, and a pink smoke rose from the engine, and it seemed to her that everything was trembling with cold. Here was the train. The windows reflected the gleaming light like the crosses on the church. It made her eyes ache to look at them. On the little platform between 2 first-class carriages a lady was standing, and Marya Vassilyevna glanced at her as she passed. Her mother! What a resemblance! Her mother had had just such luxuriant hair, just such a brow and bend of the head, and with amazing distinctiveness, for the first time in those 13 years, there rose before her mind a vivid picture of her mother, her father, her brother, their flat in Moscow, the aquarium with little fish, everything to the tiniest detail. She heard the sound of the piano, her father's voice. She felt as she had been then, young, good-looking, well-dressed, in a bright, warm room among her own people. A feeling of joy and happiness suddenly came over her. She pressed her hands to her temples in an ecstasy and called softly, beseechingly, "Mother!" And she began crying. She did not know why. Just at that instant Hanov drove up with his team of 4 horses, and seeing him she imagined happiness such as she had never had, and smiled and nodded to him as an equal and a friend, and it seemed to her that her happiness, her triumph, was glowing in the sky and on all sides, in the windows and on the trees. Her father and mother had never died. She had never been a schoolmistress. It was a long, tedious, strange dream, and now she had awakened. "Vassilyevna, get in!" And at once it all vanished. The barrier was slowly raised. Marya Vassilyevna, shivering and numb with cold, got into the cart. The carriage with the 4 horses crossed the railway line. Semyon followed it. The signalman took off his cap. And here is Vassilyevna. Here we are. End of The School Mistress. Slavery in Massachusetts, 1854, by Henry David Thoreau. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I had lately attended a meeting of the citizens of Concord, expecting, as one among many, to speak on the subject of slavery in Massachusetts, but I was surprised and disappointed to find that what had called my townsmen together was the destiny of Nebraska and not of Massachusetts, and that what I had to say would be entirely out of order. I had thought that the house was on fire and not the prairie, but though several citizens of Massachusetts are now in prison for attempting to rescue a slave from her own clutches, and not one of the speakers at that meeting expressed regret for it, not one even referred to it, it was only the disposition of some wild lands 1,000 miles off which appeared to concern them. The inhabitants of Concord are not prepared to stand by one of their own bridges, but talk only of taking up a position on the highlands beyond the Yellowstone River. Our Bittricks and Davises and Hosmers are retreating thither, and I fear that they will leave no Lexington Common between them and the enemy. There is not one slave in Nebraska. There are perhaps 1,000,000 slaves in Massachusetts. They who have been bred in the school of politics fail now and always to face the facts. Their measures are half measures and makeshifts merely. They put off the day of settlement indefinitely, and meanwhile the debt accumulates. Though the fugitive slave law had not been the subject of the discussion on that occasion, it was at length faintly resolved in my townsmen at an adjourned meeting, as I learned, that the compromise compact of 1820 having been repudiated by one of the parties, therefore the fugitive slave law of 1850 must be repealed, but this is not the reason why an iniquitous law should be repealed. The fact which the politician faces is merely that there is less honor among thieves than was supposed, and not the fact that they are thieves. As I had no opportunity to express my thoughts at that meeting, will you allow me to do so here? Again, it happens that the Boston courthouse is full of armed men holding prisoners and trying a man to find out he is not really a slave. Does anyone think that justice or God awaits Mr. Loring's decision? For him to sit there deciding still, when this question is already decided from eternity to eternity, and the unlettered slave himself and the multitude around have long since heard and assented to the decision, is simply to make himself ridiculous. We may be tempted to ask from whom he received his commission, and who he is that received it, what novel status he obeys, and what precedents are to him of authority. Such an arbiter's very existence is an impertinence. We do not ask him to make up his mind, but to make up his pack. I listen to hear the voice of a governor, commander-in-chief of the forces of Massachusetts. I hear only the creaking of crickets and the hum of insects which now fill the summer air. The governor's exploit is to review the troops on muster days. I have seen him on horseback, with his hat off, listening to a chaplain's prayer. It chances that that is all I have ever seen of a governor. I think that I could manage to get along without one. If he is not of the least use to prevent my being kidnapped, pray of what important use is he likely to be to me? When freedom is most endangered, he dwells in the deepest obscurity. A distinguished clergyman told me that he chose the profession of clergyman because it afforded the most leisure for literary pursuits. I would recommend to him the profession of a governor. 3 years ago, when the Sims tragedy was acted, I said to myself, there is such an officer, if not such a man, as the governor of Massachusetts. What has he been about the last fortnight? Has he had as much as he could do to keep on the fence during this moral earthquake? It seemed to me that no keener satire could have been aimed at, no more cutting insult could have been offered to that man than what just happened. The absence of all inquiry after him in that crisis. The worst and the most I chance to know of him is that he did not interpose that opportunity to make himself known, and worthily known. He could at least have resigned himself into fame. It appears to be forgotten that there was such a man or such an office. Yet, no doubt, he was endeavoring to fill the gubernatorial chair all the while. He was no governor of mine. He did not govern me. But at last, in the present case, the governor was heard from. after he and the United States government had perfectly succeeded in robbing a poor innocent black man of his liberty for life, and, as far as they could, of his Creator's likeness in his breast, he made a speech to his accomplices at a congratulatory supper. I have read a recent law of this state making it penal for any officer of the Commonwealth to detain or aid in the detention, anywhere within its limits, of any person for the reason that he is claimed as a fugitive slave. Also, it was a matter of notoriety that a writ of replevin to take the fugitive out of the custody of the United States Marshal could not be served for want of a sufficient force to aid the officer. I had thought that the governor was, in some sense, the executive officer of the state, that it was his business as a governor to see that the laws of the state were executed, while, as a man, he took care that he did not, by so doing, break the laws of humanity. But when there is any special important use for him, he is useless, or worse than useless, and permits the laws of the state to go unexecuted. Perhaps I do not know what are the duties of a governor, but if to be a governor requires to subject oneself to so much ignominy without remedy, if it is to put a restraint upon my manhood, I shall take care never to be governor of Massachusetts. I have not read far in the statutes of this Commonwealth. It is not profitable reading. They do not always say what is true, and they do not mean what they say. What I am concerned to know is that that man's influence and authority were on the side of the slaveholder and not the slave, of the guilty and not of the innocent, of injustice and not of justice. I never saw him of whom I speak. Indeed, I did not know he was governor until this event occurred. I heard him and Anthony Burns at the same time, and thus, undoubtedly, most will hear from him. So far am I from being governed by him. I do not mean that it was anything to his discredit that I had not heard of him, only that I heard what I did. The worst I shall say of him is that he proved no better than the majority of his constituents would be likely to prove. In my opinion, he was not equal to the occasion. The whole military force of the state at the service of a Mr. Stoodle, a slaveholder from Virginia, to enable him to catch a man whom he calls his property, but not a soldier is offered to save a citizen of Massachusetts from being kidnapped. Is this what all the soldiers, all this training, have been for these 79 years past? Have they been trained merely to rob Mexico and carry back fugitive slaves to their masters? These very nights I have heard the sound of a drum in our streets. There were men training still, and for what? I could with an effort pardon the cockerels of Concord for cowering still, for they, perchance, had not been beaten that morning, but I could not excuse this rub-a-dub of the trainees. The slave was carried back by exactly such as these, i.e. by the soldier, of whom the best you can say in this connection is that he is a fool made conspicuous by a painted coat. 3 years ago, also, just a week after the authorities of Boston assembled to carry back a perfectly innocent man, and one whom they knew to be innocent, into slavery, the inhabitants of Concord caused the bells to be rung and the cannons to be fired to celebrate their liberty, and the courage and love of liberty of their ancestors who fought at the bridge, as if those 3 million had fought for the right to be free themselves, but to hold in slavery 3 million others. Nowadays, men wear a fool's cap and call it a liberty cap. I do not know, but there are some who, if they were tied to a whipping post, and could but get one hand free, would use it to ring the bells and fire the cannons to celebrate their liberty. So some of my townsmen took the liberty to ring and fire. That was the extent of their freedom, and when the sound of the bells died away, their liberty died also. When the powder was all expended, their liberty went off with the smoke. A joke could be no broader if the inmates of the prisons were to subscribe for all the powder to be used in such salutes, and hire the jailers to do the firing and ringing for them, while they enjoyed it through the grating. This is what I thought about my neighbors. Every humane and intelligent inhabitant of Concord, when he or she heard those bells and those cannons, thought not with pride of the events of 19th April 1775, but with the shame of the events of the 12th of April 1851. But now we have half buried that old shame under a new one. Massachusetts sat waiting Mr. Loring's decision as if it could in any way affect her own criminality. Her crime, the most conspicuous and fatal crime of all, was permitting him to be the umpire in such a case. It was really the trial of Massachusetts. Every moment that she hesitated to set this man free, every moment that she now hesitates to atone for her crime, she is convicted. The commissioner on her case is God, not Edward G. God, but simply God. I wish my countrymen to consider that whatever the human law may be, neither an individual nor a nation can ever commit the least act of injustice against the obscurest individual without having to pay the penalty for it. A government which deliberately enacts injustice and persists in it will at length even become the laughingstock of the world. Much has been said about American slavery, but I think that we do not even yet realize what slavery is. If I were seriously to propose to Congress to make mankind into savages, I have no doubt that most of the members would smile at my proposition. And if any believed me to be in earnest, they would think that I proposed something much worse than Congress had ever done. But if any of them will tell me that to make a man into a savage would be any worse than to make him into a slave, that it was to enact the fugitive slave law, I will accuse him of foolishness, of intellectual incapacity, of making a distinction without a difference. The one is just as sensible a proposition as the other. I hear a good deal about trampling this law under foot. Why, one need not go out of his way to do that. The law rises not to the level of the head or the reason. Its natural habitat is in the dirt. It was born and bred and has its life only in the dust and mire, on a level with the feet, and he who walks with freedom and does not with Hindu mercy avoid treading on every venomous reptile will inevitably tread on it, and to trample it under foot, and Webster, its maker, with it, like a dirt bug and its ball. Recent events will be valuable as a criticism of the administration of justice in our midst, or rather, as showing what are the true resources of justice in any community. It has come to this, that the friends of liberty, the friends of the slave, have shuddered when they have understood that his fate was left to the legal tribunals of the country to be decided. Free men have no faith that justice will be awarded in such a case. The judge may decide this way or that. It is a kind of accident at best. It is evident that he is not a competent authority in so important a case. It is no time, then, to be judging according to his precedents, but to establish a precedent for the future. I would much rather trust to the settlement of the people. In their vote you would get something of some value, at least however small, but in the other case only the trampled judgment of an individual of no significance, be it which way it might. As to some extent fatal to the courts, when the people are compelled to go behind them, and do not wish to believe that the courts were made for fair weather and for very civil cases merely, but think of leaving it to any court in the land to decide whether more than 3 millions of people, in this case a sixth part of the nation, have a right to be free men or not. But it has been left to the courts of justice, so called, to the Supreme Court of the land, and as you all know, recognizing no authority but the Constitution, it has decided that the 3 million are, and shall continue to be, such judges as these are merely the inspectors of a picklock and murderer's tools, to tell him whether they are in working order or not, and there they think that their responsibility ends. There was a prior case on the docket, which they as judges appointed by God had no right to skip, which having been justly settled, they would have been saved from this humiliation. It was the case of the murderer himself. The law will never make men free. It is men who have got to make the law free. They are the lovers of law and order who observe the law when the government breaks it. Among human beings, the judge whose words steal the fate of a man farthest into eternity is not he who merely pronounces the verdict of the law, but he, whoever he may be, who from a love of truth, and unprejudiced by any custom or enactment of men, utters a true opinion or sentence concerning him. He it is that sentences him. Whoever can discern truth has received his commission from a higher source than the chiefest justice in the world, who can discern only law. He finds himself constituted judge of the judge. Strange that it should be necessary to state such simple truths. I am more and more convinced, with the reference to any public question, it is more important to know what the country thinks of it than what the city thinks. The city does not think much. On a moral question, I would rather have the opinions of Boxborough than of Boston and New York put together. When the former speaks, I feel as if somebody had spoken, as if humanity was yet, and a reasonable being had asserted its rights, as if some unprejudiced men among the country's hills had at length turned their attention to the subject, and by a few sensible words redeemed the reputation of the race. When in some obscure country town the farmers come together to a special town meeting to express their opinion on some subject which is vexing the land, that, I think, is the true Congress, and the most respectable one that is ever assembled in the United States. It is evident that there are in this Commonwealth at least two parties, becoming more and more distinct, the party of the city and the party of the country. I know that the country is mean enough, but I am glad to believe that there is a slight difference in her favor. But as yet she has few if any organs through which to express herself. The editorials which she reads, like the news, come from the seaboard. Let us, the inhabitants of the country, cultivate self-respect. Let us not spend to the city for aught more essential than our broadcloths and groceries, or, if we read the opinions of the city, let us entertain opinions of our own. Among measures to be adopted, I would suggest to make as earnest and vigorous an assault on the press as has already been made, and with effect, on the Church. The Church has much improved within a few years, but the press is, almost without exception, corrupt. I believe that in this country the press exerts a greater and more pernicious influence than the Church did in its worst period. We are not a religious people, but we are a nation of politicians. We do not care for the Bible, but we do care for the newspaper. At any meeting of politicians, like that at Concord the other evening, for instance, how impertinent it would be to quote from the Bible, how pertinent to quote from a newspaper or from the Constitution. The newspaper is a Bible which we read every morning and every afternoon, standing and sitting, riding and walking. It is a Bible which every man carries in his pocket, which lies on every table and counter, and which the mail and thousands of missionaries are continually dispensing. It is, in short, the only book which America has printed and which Americans read. So wide is its influence, the editor is a preacher whom you voluntarily support. Your tax is commonly 1 cent daily, and it costs nothing for pew hire. But how many of these preachers preach the truth? I repeat the testimony of many an intelligent foreigner, as well as my own convictions, when I say that probably no country has ever rubbed by so mean a class of tyrants as, with a few noble exceptions, are the editors of the periodical press in this country. And as they live and rule only by their servility, and appealing to the worst and not the better nature of men, the people who read them are in the condition of the dog that returns to his vomit. The Liberator and the Commonwealth were the only papers in Boston, as far as I know, which made themselves heard in condemnation of the cowardice and meanness of the authorities of that city as exhibited in '51. The other journals, almost without exception, by their manner of referring to and speaking of the fugitive slave law and the carrying back of the slave Sims, insulted the common sense of the country at least, and for the most part they did this, one would say, because they thought so to secure the approbation of their patrons, not being aware that a sounder sentiment prevailed to any extent in the heart of the Commonwealth. I am told that some of them have improved of late, but they are still immensely time-serving. Such is the character they have won. But, thank fortune, this preacher can be even more easily reached by the weapons of the reformer than could the recreant priest. The free men of New England have only to refrain from purchasing and reading these sheets, have only to withhold their cents, to kill a score of them at once. One whom I respect told me that he purchased Mitchell's Citizen in the cars and then throw it out the window. But would not his contempt have been more fatally expressed if he had not bought it at all? Are they Americans? Are they New Englanders? Are they inhabitants of Lexington and Concord and Framingham, who read and support the Boston Post, Mail, Journal, Advertiser, Courier, and Times? Are these the flags of our Union? I am not a newspaper reader, and may omit to name the worst. Could slavery suggest a man more complete servility than some of these journals exhibit? Is there any dust which their conduct does not lick, and make fouler still with its slime? I do not know whether the Boston Herald is still in existence, but I remember to have seen it about the streets when Sims was carried off. Did it not act its part well, serve its master faithfully? How could it have gone lower on its belly? How can a man stoop lower than he is low, do more than put his extremities in the place of the head he has, and make his head the lower extremity? When I have taken up this paper with my cuffs turned up, I have heard the gurgling of the sewer through every column. I have felt I was handling a paper picked out of the public gutters, a leaf from the gospel of the gambling house, the groggery, and the brothel, harmonizing with the gospel of the merchants' exchange. A majority of men of the North and of the South and East and West are not men of principle. If they vote, they do not send men to Congress on errands of humanity, but while their brothers and sisters are being scourged and hung for loving liberty, while I might here insist all that slavery implies and is, it is the mismanagement of wood and iron and stone and gold which concerns them. Do what you will, O government, with my wife and children, my mother and brother, my father and sister. I will obey your commands to the letter. It will indeed grieve me if you hurt them, but if you deliver them to overseers to be hunted by hounds, or to be whipped to death. But, nevertheless, I will peacefully pursue my chosen calling in this fair earth, until perchance one day, when I have put on mourning for them dead, I shall have persuaded you to relent. Such is the attitude, such are the words of Massachusetts. Rather than do this, I need not say what match I would touch, what system endeavor to blow up, but I would love my life, I would side with the light, and let the dark earth roll from under me, calling my mother and my brother to follow. I would remind my countrymen that they are to be men first, and Americans only at a late and convenient hour. No matter how valuable law may be to protect your property, even to keep soul and body together, if it do not keep you and humanity together. I am sorry to say that I doubt if there is a judge in Massachusetts who is prepared to resign his office and get his living innocently whenever it is required of him to pass sentence under a law which is merely contrary to the law of God. I am compelled to see that they put themselves, or rather are by character in this respect, exactly on a level with the marine who discharges his musket in any direction he is ordered to. They are just as much tools and as little men. Certainly they are not the more to be respected because their master enslaves their understandings and consciences instead of their bodies. The judges and lawyers, simply as such I mean, and all men of expediency, try this case by a very low and incompetent standard. They consider not whether the fugitive slave law is right, but whether it is what they call constitutional. Is virtue constitutional or vice? Is equity constitutional or inequity? In important moral and vital questions like this, it is just as impertinent to ask whether a law is constitutional or not as to ask whether it is profitable or not. They persist in being the servants of the worst of men and not the servants of humanity. The question is not whether you or your grandfather 70 years ago did not enter into an agreement to serve the devil, and that service is not accordingly now due, but whether you will not now, for once and at last, serve God in spite of your own past recreancy or that of your ancestor, by obeying the eternal and only just Constitution which he, and not any Jefferson or Adams, has written in your being. The amount of it, if the majority vote the devil to be God, the minority will live and behave accordingly, and obey the successful candidate, trusting that some time or other, by some speaker's casting vote, perhaps, they may reinstate God. This is the highest principle I can get out of or invent for my neighbors. These men act as if they believed that they could safely slide down a hill a little way, or a good way, and would surely come to a place by and by where they could begin to slide up again. This is expediency, or choosing the course which offers the slightest obstacles to the feet, that is, a downhill one. But there is no such thing as accomplishing a righteous reform by the use of expediency. There is no such thing as sliding uphill. In morals, the only sliders are backsliders. Thus we steadily worship Mammon, both school and state and church, and on the seventh day curse God with a titmar from one end of the Union to the other. Will mankind never learn that policy is not morality, that it never secures any moral right, but considers merely what is expedient, chooses the available candidate, who is invariably the devil? And what right have his constituents to be surprised, because the devil does not behave like an angel of light? What is wanted is men, not of policy, but of probity, who recognize a higher law than the Constitution, or the decision of the majority. The fate of the country does not depend on how you vote at the polls. The worst man is as strong as the best at that game. It does not depend on what kind of paper you drop into the ballot box once a year, but on what kind of man you drop from your chamber into the street every morning. What should concern Massachusetts is not the Nebraska bill, nor the Fugitive Slave Bill, but her own slaveholding and servility. Let the state dissolve her union with the slaveholder. She may wriggle and hesitate, and ask leave to read the Constitution once more, but she can find no respectable law or precedent which sanctions the continuance of such a union for an instant. Let each inhabitant of the state dissolve this union with her as long as she delays to do her duty. The events of the past month teach me to distrust fame. I see that she does not finely discriminate, but coarsely hurrahs. She considers not the simple heroism of an action, but only as it is connected with its apparent consequences. She praises till she is hoarse the easy expedient of the Boston Tea Party, but will be comparatively silent about the braver and more disinterestingly heroic act on the Boston courthouse, simply because it was unsuccessful. Covered with disgrace, the state has sat down coolly to try for their lives and liberties the men who attempted to do its duty for it, and this is called justice. They who have shown that they can behave particularly well may perchance be put under bonds for their good behavior, but whom truth requires at present to plead guilty are, of all the inhabitants of the state, preeminently innocent, while the governor and the mayor and countless officers of the Commonwealth are at large. The champions of liberty are imprisoned. Only they are guiltless who commit the crimes of contempt of such a court. It behooves every man to see that his influence is on the side of justice, and let the courts make their own characters. My sympathies in this case are wholly with the accused, and wholly against their accusers and judges. Justice is sweet and musical, but injustice is harsh and discordant. The judge still sits grinding at his organ, but it yields no music, and we hear only the sound of the handle. He believes that all the music resides in the handle, and the crowd toss him their coppers the same as before. Do you suppose that Massachusetts, which is now doing these things, which hesitates to crown these men, some of whose lawyers and even judges, perchance, may be driven to take refuge in some poor quibble, that they may not wholly outrage their instinctive sense of justice? Do you suppose that she is anything but base and servile, that she is the champion of liberty? Show me a free state and a court truly of justice, and I will fight for them, if need be. But show me Massachusetts, and I refuse her my allegiance and express contempt for her courts. The effect of a good government is to make life more valuable, of a bad one to make it less valuable. We can afford that railroad, and all merely material stock would lose some of its value, for that only compels us to live more simply and economically. But suppose that the value of life itself should be diminished. How can we make a less demand on man and nature? How live more economically in respect to virtue and all noble qualities than we do? I have lived for the last month, and I think that every man in Massachusetts capable of the sentiment of patriotism must have had a similar experience, with the sense of having suffered a vast and indefinite loss. I did not know at first what ailed me. At last it occurred to me that what I had lost was a country. I had never respected the government near to which I lived, but I had foolishly thought that I might manage to live here, minding my private affairs, and forget it. For my part, my old and worthless pursuits have lost I cannot say how much of their attraction, and I feel that my investment in life is worth many per cent less since Massachusetts has deliberately sent back an innocent man, Anthony Burns, to slavery. I dwell before, perhaps, in the illusion that my life passed somewhere only between heaven and hell. But now I cannot persuade myself that I do not dwell wholly within hell. The sight of that political organization called Massachusetts, to me morally covered with volcanic scoriae and cinders, such as Milton describes in the infernal regions. If there is any hell more unprincipled than our rulers, and we the ruled, I feel curious to see it. Life itself being worth less, all things with it, which muster to it, are worth less. Suppose you have a small library with pictures that adorn the walls, and a garden laid out around, and complete scientific and literary pursuits, etc., and discover all at once that your villa with all its contents is located in hell, and that the justice of the peace has a cloven foot and a forked tail. Do not these things suddenly lose their value in your eyes? I feel, to some extent, the state has fatally interfered with my lawful business. It has not only interrupted me in my passage through Court Street on errands of trade, but it has interrupted me and every man on his onward and upward path, on which he had trusted soon to leave Court Street far behind. What right had it to remind me of Court Street? I have found that hollow which even I had relied on for solid. I am surprised to see men going about their business as if nothing had happened. I say to myself, unfortunates, they have not heard the news. I am surprised that the man whom I just met on horseback should be so earnest to overtake his newly bought cows running away, since all property is insecure, and if they do not run away again, they may be taken away from him when he gets them. Fool, does he not know that his seed corn is worth less this year, that all beneficent harvests fail as you approach the empire of hell? No prudent man will build a stone house under these circumstances, or engage in any peaceful enterprise which it requires a long time to accomplish. Art is as long as ever, but life is more interrupted and less available for a man's proper pursuits. It is not an era of response. It is not an era of repose. We have used up all our inherent freedom. If we would save our lives, we must fight for them. I walk toward one of our ponds, but what signifies the beauty of nature when men are base? We walk to lakes to see our serenity reflected in them. When we are not serene, we go not to them. Who can be serene in a country where both the rulers and the ruled are without principle? The remembrance of my country spoils my walk. My thoughts are murder to the state, and involuntarily go plotting against her. But it chanced the other day that I scented a water lily, and a season I had waited for had arrived. It is the emblem of purity. It bursts up so pure and fair to the eye, and so sweet to the scent, as if to show us what purity and sweetness reside in, and can be extracted from, the slime and muck of earth. I think that I have plucked the first one that has opened for a mile. What confirmation of our hopes is the fragrance of this flower! I shall soon despair of the world for it, notwithstanding slavery and the cowardice and want of principle of northern men. It suggests what kind of laws have prevailed longest and widest, and still prevail, and that the time may come when men's deeds will smell as sweet. Such is the odor which the plant emits. If nature can compound this fragrance still annually, I shall believe her still young and full of vigor, her integrity and genius unimpaired, and that there is virtue even in man, too, who is fitted to perceive and love it. It reminds me that nature has been partner to no Missouri compromise. I scent no compromise in the fragrance of the water lily. It is not a Nymphaeomus dolichicide. In it, the sweet and pure and innocent are wholly surrendered from the obscene and baleful. I do not scent in this the time-serving irresolution of a Massachusetts governor or of a Boston mayor. So behave that the odor of your actions may enhance the general sweetness of the atmosphere, that when we behold or scent a flower, we may not be reminded how inconsistent your deeds are with it. For all odor is but one form of advertisement of a moral quality, and if fair actions had not been performed, the lily would not smell sweet. The foul slime stands for the sloth and vice of man, the decay of humanity, the fragrant flower that springs from it, for the purity and courage which are immortal. Slavery and servility have produced no sweet-scented flower annually to charm the senses of men, for they have no real life. They are merely a decaying and a death, offensive to all healthy nostrils. We do not complain that they live, but that they do not get buried. Let the living bury them. Even they are good for manure.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood by Charles Perrault. Read by Rebecca Snyder, Faith Christian School, April 2007. Once there was a royal couple who grieved excessively because they had no children. When at last, after long waiting, the queen presented her husband with a little daughter, His Majesty showed his joy by giving a christening feast so grand that the like of it was never known. He invited all the fairies in the land, there were 7 altogether, to stand godmothers to the little princess, hoping that each might bestow on her some good gift, as was the custom of good fairies in those days. After the ceremony, all the guests returned to the palace, where there was placed before each fairy godmother a magnificent covered dish with an embroidered table napkin, and a knife and fork of pure gold, studded with diamonds and rubies. But alas, as they placed themselves at table, there entered an old fairy who had never been invited, because more than 50 years since she had left the king's dominion on a tour of pleasure, and had not been heard of until this day. His Majesty, much troubled, desired a cover to be placed for her, but it was of common delft, for he had ordered from his jeweler only 7 gold dishes, for the 7 fairies aforesaid. The old fairy thought herself neglected, and muttered angry threats, which were overheard by one of the younger fairies, who chanced to sit beside her. This good godmother, afraid of harm to the pretty baby, hastened to hide herself behind the hangings in the hall. She did this because she wished all the others to speak first, so that if any ill gift were bestowed on the child, she could counteract it. The 6 now offered their good wishes, which, unlike most wishes, were sure to come true. The fortunate little princess was to grow up the fairest woman in the world, to have a temper sweet as an angel, to be perfectly graceful and gracious, to sing like a nightingale, to dance like a leaf on a tree, and to possess every accomplishment under the sun. Then the old fairy's turn came. Shaking her head spitefully, she uttered the wish that when the baby grew up into a young lady and learned to spin, she might prick her finger with the spindle and die of the wound. At this terrible prophecy, all the guests shuddered, and some of the more tender-hearted began to weep. The lately happy parents were almost out of their wits with grief. Upon which the wise young fairy appeared from behind the tapestry, saying cheerfully, "Your Majesties may comfort themselves. The princess shall not die. I have no power to alter the ill fortune just wished her by my ancient sister. Her finger must be pierced, and she shall then sink not into the sleep of death, but into a sleep that will last 100 years. After that time is ended, the son of a king shall come and awake her. Then all the fairies vanished. The king, in the hope of avoiding his daughter's doom, issued an edict forbidding all persons to spin, and even to have spinning wheels in their houses, on pain of instant death. But it was in vain. One day, when she was just 15 years of age, the king and queen left their daughter alone in one of their castles, where, wandering about at her will, she came to an ancient dungeon tower, climbed to the top of it, and there found a very old woman, so old and deaf that she had never heard of the king's edict, busy with her wheel. "What are you doing, good old woman?" said the princess. "I'm spinning, my pretty child." "Ah, how charming! Let me try if I can spin also." She had no sooner taken up the spindle than, being lively and obstinate, she handled it so awkwardly and carelessly that the point pierced her finger. Though it was so small a wound, she fainted away at once and dropped silently down on the floor. The poor old woman called for help. Shortly came the ladies in waiting, who tried every means to restore their young mistress, but all their care was useless. She lay beautiful as an angel, the color still lingering in her lips and cheeks, her fair bosom softly stirred with her breath. Only her eyes were fast closed. When the king, her father, and the queen, her mother, beheld her thus, they knew regret was idle. All had happened as the cruel fairy meant, but they also knew that their daughter would not sleep forever, though after 100 years it was not likely that they would either of them behold her awakening. Until that happy hour should arrive, they determined to leave her in repose. They sent away all the physicians and attendants, and themselves sorrowfully laid her upon a bed of embroidery in the most elegant apartment in the palace. There she slept, and looked like a sleeping angel still. When the misfortune happened, the kindly young fairy who had saved the princess by changing her sleep of death into the sleep of 100 years was 12,000 leagues away in the kingdom of Mataquin. But, being informed of everything, she arrived speedily in a chariot of fire drawn by dragons. The king was somewhat startled by the sight, but nevertheless went to the door of his palace, and, with a mournful countenance, presented her his hand to descend. The fairy condoled with his majesty, and approved of all he had done. Then, being a fairy of great common sense and foresight, she suggested that the princess, awakening after 100 years in this old castle, might be a good deal embarrassed, especially with a young prince by her side, to find herself alone. Accordingly, without asking anyone's leave, she touched with her magic wand the entire population of the palace, except the king and queen. Governesses, ladies of honor, waiting-maids, gentlemen, ushers, cooks, kitchen girls, pages, footmen, down to the horses that were in the stables and the grooms that attended them, she touched each and all. Nay, with kind consideration for the feelings of the princess, she even touched the little fat lapdog Puffy, who had laid himself down beside his mistress on her splendid bed. He, like all the rest, fell fast asleep in a moment. The very spits that were before the kitchen fire ceased turning, and the fire itself went out, and everything became as silent as if it were the middle of the night, or as if the palace were a palace of the dead. The king and queen, having kissed their daughter, and wept over her a little, but not much, she looked so sweet and content, departed from the castle, giving orders that it was to be approached no more. The command was unnecessary, for in 1/4 of an hour there sprang up around it a wood so thick and thorny that neither beasts nor men could attempt to penetrate there. Above this dense mass of forest could only be seen the top of the high tower where the lovely princess slept. A great many changes happened in 100 years. The king, who never had a second child, died, and his throne passed on to another royal family. So entirely was the story of the poor princess forgotten that when the reigning king's son, being one day out hunting and stopped in a chase by this formidable wood, inquired what wood it was, and what were those towers which he saw appearing out of the mist of it, no one could answer him. At length an old peasant was found who remembered having heard his grandfather say to his father that in this tower was a princess, beautiful as the day, who was doomed to sleep there for 100 years, until awakened by a king's son, her destined bridegroom. At this the young prince, who had the spirit of a hero, determined to find out the truth for himself. Spurred on by both generosity and curiosity, he leaped from his horse and began to find his way through the thick wood. To his amazement, the stiff branches all gave way, and the ugly thorns of their own accord, and the brambles buried themselves in the earth to let him pass. This done, they closed behind him, allowing none of his suite to follow. But, ardent and young, he went boldly on alone. The first thing he saw was enough to smite him with fear. Bodies of men and horses lay extended on the ground, but the men had faces not death-white, but red as peonies, and beside them were glasses half filled with wine, showing that they had gone to sleep drinking. Next he entered a large court paved with marble, where stood rows of guards presenting arms, but as if cut out of stone. Then he passed through many chambers, where gentlemen and ladies, all in the dress of the past century, slept at their ease, some standing, some sitting. The pages were lurking in corners, the ladies of honor were stooping over their embroidery frames, or listening, apparently with polite attention, to the gentlemen of the court, but all were as silent as statues, and as immovable. Their clothes, strange to say, were fresh and new as ever, and not a particle of dust or spider-web had gathered over the furniture, though it had not known a broom for 100 years. Finally, the astonished prince came to an inner chamber, where was the fairest sight his eyes had ever beheld. A young girl of wonderful beauty lay asleep on an embroidered bed, and she looked as if she had only just closed her eyes. Trembling, the prince approached and knelt beside her. Some say he kissed her, but as nobody saw it, and she never told, we cannot be quite sure of the fact. However, as the end of the enchantment had come, the princess waked at once, and looking at him with eyes of the tenderest regard, said drowsily, "Is it you, my prince? I have waited for you very long." Charmed with these words, and still more with the tone in which they were uttered, the prince assured her that he loved her more than his life. Nevertheless, he was the most embarrassed of the two, for, thanks to the kind fairy, the princess had plenty of time to dream of him during her century of slumber, while he had never even heard of her till an hour before. For a long time did they sit talking, and yet had not said half enough. Their only interruption was the little dog Puffy, who had awakened with his mistress, and now began to be exceedingly jealous. Meantime all the attendants, whose enchantment was also broken, not being in love, were ready to die of hunger after their fast of 100 years. A lady of honor ventured to say that dinner was served, whereupon the prince handed his beloved princess at once to the great hall. She did not wait to dress for dinner, being already perfectly and magnificently attired, though in a fashion somewhat out of date. However, her lover had the politeness not to notice this, nor to remind her that she was dressed exactly like her royal grandmother, whose portrait still hung on the palace walls. During dinner, a concert by the attendant musicians took place, and, considering they had not touched their instruments for a century, they played extremely well. They ended with a wedding march. For that very evening the marriage of the prince and princess was celebrated, and although the bride was nearly 100 years older than the bridegroom, it is remarkable that fact would never have been discovered by anyone unacquainted therewith. After a few days they went together out of the castle and enchanted wood, both of which immediately vanished, and were never more beheld by mortal eyes. The princess was restored to her ancestral kingdom, and after a few years the prince and she became king and queen, and ruled long and happily. The end of The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood by Charles Perrault.
Tajima by Miss Mitford. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chris Gladis. Once upon a time, a certain Ronin, Tajima Shume by name, an able and well-read man, being on his travels to see the world, went up to Kyoto by the Tokaido, the road of the Eastern Sea, the famous high road leading from Kyoto to Edo. The name is also used to indicate the provinces through which it runs. One day, in the neighborhood of Nagoya, in the province of Owari, he fell in with a wandering priest, with whom he entered into conversation. Finding out that they were bound for the same place, they agreed to travel together, beguiling their weary way by pleasant talk on diverse matters. And so, by degrees, as they became more intimate, they began to speak without restraint about their private affairs, and the priest, trusting thoroughly in the honor of his companion, told him the object of his journey. "For some time past," said he, "I have nourished a wish that has engrossed all my thoughts, for I am bent on setting up a molten image in honor of Buddha. With this object I have wandered through various provinces, collecting alms, and, who knows by what weary toil, we have succeeded in amassing 200 ounces of silver, enough, I trust, to erect a handsome bronze figure. What says the proverb? He who bears a jewel in his bosom bears poison. Hardly had the Ronin heard these words of the priest than an evil heart arose within him, and he thought to himself, Man's life, from the womb to the grave, is made up of good and ill luck. Here am I, nearly 40 years old, a wanderer, without a calling or even a hope of advancement in this world. To be sure, it seems a shame. Yet if I could steal the money this priest is boasting about, I could live at ease for the rest of my days. And so he began casting about how best he might compass his purpose. But the priest, far from guessing the drift of his comrade's thoughts, journeyed cheerfully on till they reached the town of Kuana. Here there is an arm of the sea, which is crossed in ferryboats, that start as soon as some 20 or 30 passengers are gathered together, and in one of these boats the two travelers embarked. About halfway across, the priest was taken with a sudden necessity to go to the side of the boat, and the Ronin, following him, tripped him up while no one was looking, and flung him into the sea. When the boatmen and the passengers heard the splash, and saw the priest struggling in the water, they were afraid, and made every effort to save him. But the wind was fair, and the boat running swiftly under the bellying sails, so they were soon a few hundred yards off from the drowning man, who sank before the boat could be turned to rescue him. When he saw this, the Ronin feigned the utmost grief and dismay, and said to his fellow passengers, This priest, whom we have just lost, was my cousin. He was going to Kyoto to visit the shrine of his patron, and as I happened to have business there as well, we settled to travel together. Now, alas, by this misfortune, my cousin is dead, and I am left alone. He spoke so feelingly and wept so freely that the passengers believed his story, and pitied and tried to comfort him. Then the Ronin said to the boatmen, We ought by rights to report this matter to the authorities. But as I am pressed for time, and the business might bring trouble on yourselves as well, perhaps we had better hush it up for the present. I will at once go on to Kyoto and tell my cousin's patron, besides writing home about it. What think you, gentlemen? Added he, turning to the other travelers. They, of course, were only too glad to avoid any hindrance to their onward journey, and all with one voice agreed to what the Ronin had proposed. And so the matter was settled. When at length they reached the shore, they left the boat, and every man went his way. But the Ronin, overjoyed in his heart, took the wandering priest's luggage, and, putting it with his own, pursued his journey to Kyoto. On reaching the capital, the Ronin changed his name from Shumei to Tokubei, and, giving up his position as a samurai, turned merchant and traded with the dead man's money. Fortune favoring his speculations, he began to amass great wealth, and lived at his ease, denying himself nothing. And in course of time he married a wife who bore him a child. Thus the days and months wore on, till one fine summer's night, some 3 years after the priest's death, Tokubei stepped out on the veranda of his house to enjoy the cool air and the beauty of the moonlight. Feeling dull and lonely, he began musing over all kinds of things, when, on a sudden, the deed of murder and theft, done so long ago, vividly recurred to his memory, and he thought to himself, Here am I, grown rich and fat on the money I wantonly stole. Since then, all has gone well with me. Yet, Had I not been poor, I had never turned assassin or thief. Oh, woe betide me! What a pity it was!" And, as he was revolving the matter in his mind, a feeling of remorse came over him, in spite of all he could do. While his conscience thus smote him, he suddenly, to his utter amazement, beheld the faint outline of a man standing near a fir tree in the garden. On looking more attentively, he perceived that the man's whole body was thin and worn, and the eyes sunken and dim. And in that poor ghost that was before him, he recognized the very priest whom he had thrown into the sea at Kuana. Chilled with horror, he looked again, and saw that the priest was smiling in scorn. He would have fled into the house, but the ghost stretched forth its withered arm, and, clutching the back of his neck, scowled at him with a vindictive glare and a hideous ghastliness of mien so unspeakably awful that any ordinary man would have swooned with fear. But Tokubei, tradesman though he was, had once been a soldier, and was not easily matched for daring. So he shook off the ghost, and, leaping into the room for his dirk, laid about him boldly enough. But, strike as he would, the spirit, fading into the air, eluded his blows, and suddenly reappeared, only to vanish again. And from that time forth Tokubei knew no rest, and was haunted night and day. At length, undone by such ceaseless vexation, Tokubei fell ill, and kept muttering, "Oh, misery, misery, the wandering priest is coming to torture me." Hearing his moans and the disturbance he made, the people in the house fancied he was mad, and called in a physician, who prescribed for him. But neither pill nor potion could cure Tokubei, whose strange frenzy soon became the talk of the whole neighborhood. Now, it chanced that the story reached the ears of a certain wandering priest, who lodged in the next street. When he heard the particulars, this priest gravely shook his head, as though he knew all about it, and sent a friend to Tokubei's house to say that a wandering priest, dwelling hard by, had heard of his illness, and, were it never so grievous, would undertake to heal it by means of his prayers. And Tokubei's wife, driven half wild by her husband's sickness, lost not a moment in sending for the priest and taking him to the sick man's room. But no sooner did Tokubei see the priest than he yelled out, "Help! Help! There is the wandering priest come to torment me again. Forgive! Forgive!" And, hiding his head under the coverlet, he lay quivering all over. Then the priest turned all present out of the room, put his mouth to the affrighted man's ear, and whispered, "3 years ago, at the Kuana ferry, you flung me into the water, and well you remember it." But Tokubei was speechless, and could only quake with fear. "Happily, I had learned to swim and to dive as a boy, so I reached the shore, and, after wandering through many provinces, succeeded in setting up a bronze figure to Buddha, thus fulfilling the wish of my heart. On my journey homeward, I took a lodging in the next street, and there heard of your marvelous ailment. Thinking I could divine its cause, I came to see you, and am glad to find that I was not mistaken. You have done a hateful deed, but am I not a priest? And have I not forsaken the things of this world, and would it not ill become me to bear malice? Repent, therefore, and abandon your evil ways. To see you do so, I should esteem the height of happiness. Be of good cheer now, and look me in the face, and you will see that I am really a living man, and no vengeful goblin come to torment you." Seeing he had no ghost to deal with, and overwhelmed by the priest's kindness, Tokubei burst into tears, and answered, "Indeed, indeed, I don't know what to say. In a fit of madness, I was tempted to kill and to rob you. Fortune befriended me ever after, but the richer I grew, the more keenly I felt how wicked I had been, and the more I foresaw that my victim's vengeance would one day overtake me. Haunted by this thought, I lost my nerve, till one night I beheld your spirit, and from that time fell ill. But how you managed to escape and are still alive is more than I can understand." "A guilty man," said the priest with a smile, "shudders at the rustling of the wind, or the chattering of a stork's beak. A murderer's conscience preys upon his mind till he sees what is not. Poverty drives a man to crimes which he repents of in his wealth. How true is the doctrine of Moshi, that the heart of man, pure by nature, is corrupted by circumstances." Thus he held forth, and Tokubei, who had long since repented of his crime, implored forgiveness, and gave him a large sum of money, saying, "Half of this is the amount I stole from you 3 years since. The other half I entreat you to accept as interest, or as a gift." The priest at first refused the money, but Tokubei insisted on his accepting it, and did all he could to detain him, but in vain, for the priest went on his way, and bestowed the money on the poor and the needy. As for Tokubei himself, he soon shook off his disorder, and thenceforward lived at peace with all men, revered both at home and abroad, and ever intent on good and charitable deeds. End of Tajima by Miss Mitford.
Two Cases of Grip by M. Quad. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Debra Lynn in Northern Lower Michigan, March 2007. "What's this? What's this?" exclaimed Mr. Bowser as he came home the other evening and found Mrs. Bowser lying on the sofa and looking very much distressed. "The doctor says it's the grip, a second attack," she explained. "I was taken with a chill and headache about noon and—" "Grip? Second attack? That's all nonsense, Mrs. Bowser. Nobody can have the grip a second time." "But the doctor says so." "Then the doctor is an idiot, and I'll tell him so to his face. I know what's the matter with you. You've been walking around the backyard barefoot, or doing some other foolish thing. I expected it, however. No woman is happy unless she's flat down about half the time. How on earth any of your sex manage to live to be 20 years old is a mystery to me. The average woman has no more sense than a rag baby." "I haven't been careless," she replied. "I know better. Of course you have. If you hadn't been, you wouldn't be where you are. Grip be hanged. Well, it's only right that you should suffer for it. Call it what you wish, but don't expect any sympathy from me. While I use every precaution to preserve my health, you go sloshing around in your bare feet, or sit on a cake of ice to read a dime novel, or do some other tomfool thing to flatten you out. I refuse to sympathize with you, Mrs. Bowser. Absolutely and teetotally refuse to utter one word of pity." Mrs. Bowser had nothing to say in reply. Mr. Bowser ate his dinner alone, took advantage of the occasion to drive a few nails and make a great noise, and by went off to his club and was gone until midnight. Next morning Mrs. Bowser felt a bit better, and made a heroic attempt to be about until he started for the office. The only reference he made to her illness was to say, "If you live to be 300 years old, you may possibly learn something about the laws of health and be able to keep out of bed 3 days in a week." Mrs. Bowser was all right at the end of 3 or 4 days, and nothing more was said. Then one afternoon at 3 o'clock a carriage drove up, and a stranger assisted Mr. Bowser into the house. He was looking pale and ghastly, and his chin quivered and his knees wobbled. "What is it, Mr. Bowser?" she exclaimed as she met him at the door. "Bed, doctor, death," he gasped in reply. Mrs. Bowser got him to bed and examined him for bullet holes or knife wounds. There were none. He had no broken limbs. He hadn't fallen off a horse or been half drowned. When she had satisfied herself on these points, she asked, "How were you taken?" "With a chill," he gasped, "with a chill and a backache." "I thought so, Mr. Bowser. You have the grip, a second attack. As I have some medicine left, there's no need to send for the doctor. I'll have you all right in a day or two." "Get the doctor at once," wailed Mr. Bowser, "or I'm a dead man. Such a backache, so cold. Mrs. Bowser, if I should die, I hope—" Emotion overcame Mr. Bowser, and he could say no more. The doctor came and pronounced it a second attack of the grip, but a very mild one. When he had departed, Mrs. Bowser didn't accuse Mr. Bowser with putting on his summer flannels a month too soon, with forgetting his umbrella and getting soaked through, with leaving his rubbers at home and having damp feet all day. She didn't express her wonder that he hadn't died years ago, nor predict that when he reached the age of Methuselah he would know better than to roll in snowbanks or stand around in mud puddles. She didn't kick over chairs or slam doors or leave him alone. When Mr. Bowser shed tears, she wiped them away. When he moaned, she held his hand. When he said he felt that the grim spectre was near and wanted to kiss the baby good-bye, she cheered him with the prediction that he would be a great deal better next day. Mr. Bowser didn't get up next day, though the doctor said he could. He lay in bed and sighed and uttered sorrowful moans and groans. He wanted toast and preserves. He had to have help to turn over. He worried about a relapse. He had to have a damp cloth on his forehead. He wanted to have a council of doctors, and he read the copy of his last will and testament over 3 times. Mr. Bowser was all right next morning, however. When Mrs. Bowser asked him how he felt, he replied, "How do I feel? Why, as right as a trivet, of course. When a man takes the care of himself that I do, when he has the nerve and will power I have, he can throw off most anything. You would have died, Mrs. Bowser, but I was scarcely affected. It was just a play spell. I'd like to be real sick once, just to see how it would seem. Cholera, I suppose it was. But outside of feeling a little tired, I wasn't at all affected." And the dutiful Mrs. Bowser looked at him and swallowed it all and never said a word to hurt his feelings. End of 2 Cases of Grip by M. Quad.
A Visit to Newgate. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Visit to Newgate by Charles Dickens. The force of habit is a trite phrase in everybody's mouth, and it is not a little remarkable that those who use it most as applied to others unconsciously afford in their own persons singular examples of the power which habit and custom exercise over the minds of men, and of the little reflection they are apt to bestow on subjects with which every day's experience has rendered them familiar. If Bedlam could be suddenly removed like another Aladdin's palace, and set down on the space now occupied by Newgate, scarcely one man out of 100, whose road to business every morning lies through Newgate Street or the Old Bailey, would pass the building without bestowing a hasty glance on its small grated windows, and a transient thought upon the condition of the unhappy beings immured in the dismal cells. And yet these same men, day by day and hour by hour, pass and repass this gloomy depository of the guilty and misery of London, in one perpetual stream of life and bustle, utterly unmindful of the throng of wretched creatures pent up within it, nay, not even knowing, or if they do, not heeding the fact that as they pass one particular angle of the massive wall with a light laugh or a merry whistle, they stand within 1 yard of a fellow creature, bound and helpless, whose hours are numbered, from whom the last feeble ray of hope has fled forever, and whose miserable career will shortly terminate in a violent and shameful death. Contact with death, even in its least terrible shape, is solemn and appalling. How much more awful is it to reflect on this near vicinity to the dying, to men in full health and vigor, in the flower of youth or the prime of life, with all their faculties and perceptions as acute and perfect as your own, but dying none the less, dying as surely with the hand of death imprinted upon them as indelibly as if mortal disease had wasted their frames to shadows, and corruption had already begun. It is with some such thought as these that we determined, not many weeks since, to visit the interior of Newgate, in an amateur capacity, of course, and having carried our intentions into effect, we proceed to lay its results before our readers, in the hope founded more upon the nature of the subject than on any presumptuous confidence in our own descriptive powers. That this paper may not be found wholly devoid of interest, we have only to presume that we do not intend to fatigue the reader with any statistical accounts of the prison. They will be found at length in numerous reports of numerous committees, and a variety of authorities of equal weight. We took no note, made no memoranda, measured none of the yards, ascertained the exact number of inches in no particular room, were unable even to report of how many apartments the jail is composed. We saw the prison, and saw the prisoners, and what we did see, and what we thought, we will tell at once in our own way. Having delivered our credentials to the servant who answered our knock at the door of the governor's house, we were ushered into the office, a little room on the right side as you enter, with two windows looking into the Old Bailey, fitted up like an ordinary attorney's office or merchant's counting house, with the usual fixtures: a waistcoated partition, a shelf or two, a desk, a couple of stools, a pair of clerks, an almanac, a clock, and a few maps. After a little delay, occasioned by sending into the interior of the prison for the officer whose duty it was to conduct us, that functionary arrived, a respectable-looking man of about 2 or 3 and 50, in a broad-brimmed hat and full suit of black, who, but for his keys, would have looked quite as much like a clergyman as a turnkey. We were disappointed he had not even top-boots on. Following our conductor by a door opposite to that at which we had entered, we arrived at a small room, without any other furniture than a little desk, and a book for visitors' autographs, and a shelf on which were a few boxes for papers and casts of the heads and faces of the 2 notorious murderers, Bishop and Williams, the former in particular exhibiting a style of head and set of features which might have afforded sufficient moral grounds for his instant execution at any time, even had there been no other evidence against him. Leaving this room also by an opposite door, we found ourselves at the lodge which opens on the Old Bailey, one side of which is plentifully garnished with a choice collection of heavy sets of irons, including those worn by the redoubtable Jack Sheppard, a genuine, and those said to have been graced by the sturdy limbs of the no less celebrated Dick Turpin, doubtful. From this lodge a heavy oaken gate, bound with iron, studded with nails of the same material, and guarded by another turnkey, opens on a few steps, if we remember right, which terminate in a narrow and dismal stone passage running parallel with the Old Bailey, and leading to the different yards through a number of tortuous and intricate windings, guarded in their turn by huge gates and gratings, whose appearance is sufficient to dispel at once the slight hope of escape that any newcomer may have entertained, and the very recollections of which, on eventually traversing the place again, involves one in a maze of confusion. It is necessary to explain here that the buildings in the prison, or in other words the different wards, form a square, of which the 4 sides abut respectively on the Old Bailey, the Old College of Physicians, now forming a part of Newgate Market, the Sessions House, and Newgate Street. The intermediate space is divided into several paved yards, in which the prisoners take such air and exercise as can be had in such a place. These yards, with the exception of that in which the prisoners under sentence of death are confined, of which we shall presently give a more detailed description, run parallel with Newgate Street, and consequently from the Old Bailey, as it were, to Newgate Market. The women's side is in the right wing of the prison nearest the Sessions House. As we were introduced into this part of the building first, we will adopt the same order, and introduce our readers to it also. Turning to the right, then, down the passage to which we now adverted, omitting any mention of intervening gates, for if we noticed every gate that was unlocked for us to pass through, and locked again as soon as we had passed, we should require a gate at every comma. We came to a door composed of thick bars of wood, through which were discernible, passing to and fro, a narrow yard. Some 20 women, the majority of whom, however, as soon as they were aware of the presence of strangers, retreated into their wards. One side of this yard is railed off at a considerable distance, and formed into a kind of iron cage about 5 feet 10 inches in height, roofed at the top, and defended in front by iron bars, from which the friends of the female prisoners communicate with them. In one corner of the singular-looking den was a yellow, haggard, decrepit old woman in a tattered gown that had once been black, and the remains of an old straw bonnet with faded ribbon of the same hue, in earnest conversation with a young girl, a prisoner, of course, of about 22. It is impossible to imagine a more poverty-stricken object, or a creature so borne down in soul and body by excess of misery and destitution, as the old woman. The girl was a good-looking, robust female, with a profusion of hair streaming about in the wind, for she had no bonnet on, and a man's silk pocket handkerchief loosely thrown over a most ample pair of shoulders. The old woman was talking in that low, stifled tone of voice which tells so forcibly of mental anguish, and every now and then burst into an irrepressible, sharp, abrupt cry of grief, the most distressing sound that ears can hear. The girl was perfectly unmoved. Hardened beyond all hope of redemption, she listened doggedly to her mother's entreaties, whatever they were, and beyond inquiring after Jem, and eagerly catching at the few halfpennies her miserable parent had brought her, took no more apparent interest in the conversation than the most unconcerned spectators. Heaven knows there were enough of them, in the persons of the other prisoners in the yard, who were no more concerned by what was passing before their eyes and within their hearing than if they were blind and deaf. Why should they be? Inside the prison and out, such scenes were too familiar to them to excite even a passing thought, unless of ridicule or contempt for feelings which they had long since forgotten. A little further on, a squalid-looking woman in a slovenly thick-bordered cap, with her arms muffled in a large red shawl, the fringed ends of which straggled nearby to the bottom of a dirty white apron, was communicating some instructions to her visitor, her daughter evidently. The girl was thinly clad and shaking with the cold. Some ordinary word of recognition passed between her and her mother when she appeared at the grating, but neither hope, condolence, regret, nor affection was expressed on either side. The mother whispered her instructions, and the girl received them with her pinched-up, half-starved features twisted into an expression of careful cunning. It was some scheme for the woman's defense that she was disclosing. Perhaps a sullen smile came over the girl's face for an instant, as if she were pleased, not so much at the probability of her mother's liberation, as at the chance of her getting off in spite of her prosecutions. The dialogue was soon concluded, and with the same careless indifference with which they had approached each other, the mother turned towards the inner end of the yard, and the girl to the gate at which she had entered. The girl belonged to a class, unhappily, but too extensive, the very existence of which should make men's hearts bleed. Barely past her childhood, it required but a glance to discover that she was one of those children, born and bred in neglect and vice, who have never known what childhood is, who have never been taught to love and court a parent's smile, or to dread a parent's frown. The thousand nameless endearments of childhood, its gaiety and its innocence, are alike unknown to them. They have entered at once upon the stern realities and miseries of life, and to their better nature it is almost hopeless to appeal in after times by any of the references which will awaken, if it only be for a moment, some good feeling in ordinary bosoms, however corrupt they may have become. Talk to them of parental solicitude, the happy days of childhood, and the merry games of infancy. Tell them hunger and the streets, beggary and stripes, the gin shop, the station house, and the pawnbroker's, and they will understand you. 2 or 3 women were standing in different parts of the grating, conversing with their friends, but a very large proportion of the prisoners appeared to have no friends at all, beyond such as their old companions as might happen to be within the walls. So, passing hastily down the yard, and pausing only for an instant to notice the little incidents we have just recorded, we were conducted up a clean and well-lighted flight of stone stairs to one of the wards. There are several in this part of the building, but a description of one is a description of the whole. It was a spacious, bare, whitewashed apartment, lighted, of course, by windows looking into the interior of the prison, but far more light and airy than one could reasonably expect to find in such a situation. There was a large fire with a deal table before it, round which 10 or a dozen women were seated on wooden forms at dinner. Along both sides of the room ran a shelf. Below it, at regular intervals, a row of large hooks were fixed on the wall, on each of which was hung the sleeping mat of a prisoner, her rug and blanket being folded up and placed on the shelf above. At night these mats were placed on the floor, each beneath the hook on which it hangs during the day. The ward is thus made to answer the purpose both of a day room and a sleeping apartment. Over the fireplace was a large sheet of plasterboard, on which were displayed a variety of texts from Scripture, which were also scattered about the room in scraps about the size and shape of the copy slips which are used in schools. On the table was a sufficient provision of a kind of stewed beef and brown bread in pewter dishes, which are kept perfectly bright and displayed on shelves in great order and regularity when they are not in use. The women rose hastily at our entrance, and retired in a hurried manner to either side of the fireplace. They were all cleanly, many of them decently, attired, and there was nothing peculiar either in their appearance or demeanour. One of the 2 resumed the needlework, which they had probably laid aside at the commencement of their meal. Others gazed at the visitors with listless curiosity, and a few retired behind their companions to the very end of the room, as if desirous to avoid even the casual observation of the strangers. Some old Irish women, both in this and other wards, to whom the thing was no novelty, appeared perfectly indifferent to our presence, and remained standing close to the seats from which they had just risen. But the general feeling among the females seemed to be one of uneasiness during the period of our stay among them, which was very brief. Not a word was uttered during the time of our remaining, unless indeed by the wardswoman, in reply to some question which we put to the turnkey who accompanied us. In every ward on the female side a wardswoman is appointed to preserve order, and a similar regulation is adopted among the males. The wardsmen and wardwomen are all prisoners selected for good conduct. They alone are allowed the privilege of sleeping on bedsteads, a small stump bedstead being placed in every ward for that purpose. On both sides of the jail is a small receiving room, to which prisoners are conducted on their first reception, and whence they cannot be removed until they have been examined by the surgeon of the prison. Retracing our steps to the dismal passage in which we found ourselves at first, and which, by the by, contains 3 or 4 dark cells for the accommodation of refractory prisoners, we were led through a narrow yard to the school, a portion of the prison set apart for boys under 14 years of age, In a tolerable sized room, in which were writing materials and some copybooks, was the schoolmaster with a couple of his pupils, the remainder having been fetched from the adjoining apartment. The whole were drawn up in line for our inspection. There were 14 of them in all, some with shoes, some without, some in pinafores without jackets, others in jackets without pinafores, and one in scarce anything at all. The whole number, without an exception, we believe, have been committed for trial on charges of pickpocketing, and 14 such terrible little faces we never beheld. There was not one redeeming feature among them, not a glance of honesty, not a wink expressive of anything but the gallows and the hulks in the whole collection. As to anything like shame or contrition, that was entirely out of the question. They were eventually quite gratified at being thought worth the trouble of looking at. Their idea appeared to be that we had come to see Newgate as a grand affair, and that they were an indispensable part of the show, and every boy as he fell in to the line actually seemed as pleased and important as if he had done something excessively meritorious in getting there at all. We never looked upon a more disagreeable sight, because we never saw 14 such helpful creatures of neglect before. On either side of the schoolyard is a yard for men, in one of which, that towards Newgate Street, prisoners of the more respectable class are confined. Of the other we have little description to offer, as the different wards necessarily partake of the same character. They are provided, like the wards on the women's side, with mats and rugs, which are disposed of in the same manner during the day. The only very striking difference between their appearance and that of the wards inhabited by the females is the utter absence of any employment. Huddled together on two opposite forms by the fireside sit 20 men perhaps, here a boy in livery, there a man in a rough greatcoat and top boots, farther on a desperate-looking fellow in his shirt-sleeves with an old Scotch cap upon his shaggy head. Near him again a tall ruffian in a smock-frock. Next to him a miserable being of distressed appearance, with his head resting on his hands. All alike in one respect, all idle and listless. When they do leave the fire, sauntering moodily about, lounging in the window, or leaning against the wall, vacantly swinging their bodies to and fro. With the exception of the man reading an old newspaper in 2 or 3 instances, this was the case in every ward we entered. The only communication these men have with their friends is through 2 closed iron gratings, with an intermediate space of about a yard in width between the two, so that nothing can be handed across, nor can the prisoner have any communications by touch with the prisoner who visits him. The married men have a separate grating at which to see their wives, but its construction is the same. The prison chapel is situated at the back of the governor's house, the latter having no windows looking into the interior of the prison. Whether the associations connected with this place, the knowledge that here a portion of the brutal service is, on some dreadful occasions, performed over the quick and not upon the dead, casts over it a still more gloomy and sombre air than art has imparted to it. We know not, but its appearance is very striking. There is something in a silent and deserted place of worship, solemn and impressive at any time, and the very dissimilarity of this one from any we have been accustomed to only enhances the impression. The meanness of its appointments, the bare scanty pulpit with the paltry painted pillars on either side, the women's gallery with its great heavy curtain, the men's with its unpainted benches and dingy front, the tottering little table at the altar, with the condiments on the wall above it, scarcely legible through lack of paint and dust and damp, so unlike the velvet and gilding, the marble and wood of a modern church, are strange and striking. There is one object, too, which rivets the attention and fascinates the gaze, and from which we may turn horror-stricken in vain, for the recollection of it will haunt us, waking and sleeping, for a long time afterward. Immediately below the reading desk, on the floor of the chapel, forming the most conspicuous object in this little area is the condemned pew, a huge black pen in which the wretched people who are singled out for death are placed on Sunday preceding their execution, in sight of all their fellow prisoners, from many of whom they may have been separated but a week before, to hear prayers for their own souls, to join in the responses of their own burial service, and to listen to an address warning their recent companions to take example by their fate, and urging themselves, while yet there is time, nearly 24 hours, to turn and flee from the wrath to come. Imagine what have been the feelings of the men whom that fearful pew has enclosed, and of whom, between the gallows and the knife, no mortal remnant may now remain. Think of the hopeless clinging to life to the last, and the wild despair, far exceeding in anguish the felon's death itself, by which they have heard the certainty of their speedy transmission to another world, with all their crimes upon their heads, rung into their ears by the officiating clergyman. At one time, and at no distant period either, the coffins of the men about to be executed were placed in that pew, upon the seat by their side, during the whole service. It may seem incredible, but it is true. Let us hope that the increased spirit of civilization and humanity, which abolished this frightful and degrading custom, may extend itself to other usages equally barbarous, usages which have not even the plea of utility in their defense, as every year's experience has shown them to be more and more inefficacious. Leaving the chapel, descending to the passage so frequently alluded to, and crossing the yard before noticed, as being allotted to prisoners of a more respectable description than the general of men confined here, the visitor arrives at a thick iron gate of great size and strength. Having been admitted through it by the turnkey on duty, he turns sharp round to the left, and pauses before another gate, and having passed this last barrier, he stands in the most terrible part of this gloomy building, the condemned ward. The press yard, well known by name to newspaper readers from its frequent mention in accounts of executions, is at the corner of the building, and next to the ordinary house, in Newgate Street, running from Newgate Street towards the centre of the prison, parallel with Newgate Market. It is a long, narrow court, of which a portion of the wall in Newgate Street forms one end, and the gate at the other. At the upper end, on the left hand, that is, adjoining the wall in Newgate Street, is a cistern of water, and at the bottom of a double grating, of which the gate itself forms a part, similar to that before described. Through these gates the prisoners are allowed to see their friends, a turnkey always remaining in the vacant space between. During the whole interview, immediately on the right as you enter, is a building containing the press room, day room, and cells. The yard is on every side surrounded by lofty walls, guarded by chevaux de frise, and the whole is under the constant inspection of vigilant and experienced turnkeys. The first apartment into which we were conducted, which was at the top of a staircase and immediately over the press room, were 25 or 30 prisoners, all under sentence of death, awaiting the result of the recorder's report. Men of all ages and appearances, from a hardened old offender with swarthy face and grizzly beard of 3 days' growth, to a handsome boy not 14 years old, and of singularly youthful appearance even for that age, who had been condemned for burglary. There was nothing remarkable in the appearance of these prisoners. 1 or 2 decently dressed men were brooding with a dejected air over the fire. Several little groups of 2 or 3 had been engaged in conversation at the upper end of the room, or in the window, and the remaining were crowded round a young man seated at a table, who appeared to be engaged in teaching the younger ones to write. The room was large, airy, and clean. There was very little anxiety or mental suffering depicted in the countenance of any of the men. They had all been sentenced to death, it is true, and the recorder's report had not yet been made, but we questioned whether there was a man among them, notwithstanding, who did not know that although he had undergone the ceremony, it never was intended that his life should be sacrificed. On the table lay a testament, but there were no tokens of its having been in recent use. In the press room below were 3 men, the nature of whose offence rendered it necessary to separate them, even from their companions in guilt. It is a long, sombre room, with 2 windows sunk into the stone wall, and here the wretched men are pinioned on the morning of their execution, before moving towards the scaffold. The fate of one of these prisoners was uncertain, some mitigatory circumstance having come to light since his trial, which had been humanely represented in the proper quarter. The other 2 had nothing to expect from the mercy of the crown. Their doom was sealed. No plea could be urged in extenuation of their crime, and they well knew that for them there was no hope in this world. The 2 short ones, the turnkey whispered, are dead men. The man to whom we have alluded as entertaining some hope of escape was lounging, at the greatest distance he could place between himself and his companions, in the window nearest the door. He was probably aware of our approach, and had assumed an air of courageous indifference. His face was purposely averted towards the window, and he stirred not an inch while we were present. The other 2 men were at the upper end of the room. One of them, who was imperfectly seen in the dim light, had his back toward us, and was stooping over the fire with his right arm on the mantelpiece and his head sunk upon it. The other was leaning on the sill of the farthest window. The light fell upon him, and communicated to his pale, haggard face and disordered hair an appearance which at that distance was ghastly. His cheek rested upon his hand, and with his face a little raised, and his eyes wildly staring before him, he seemed to be unconsciously intent on counting the chinks in the opposite wall. We passed this room again afterwards. The first man was pacing up and down in the court with a firm military step. He had been a soldier in the Foot Guards, and a cloth cap jauntily thrown on one side of his head. He bowed respectfully to our conductor, and the salute was returned. The other 2 still remained at the positions we had described, and were as motionless as statues. A few paces up the yard, and forming a continuation of the building in which are the 2 rooms we have just quitted, lie the condemned cells. The entrance is by a narrow and obscure staircase, leading to a dark passage in which a charcoal stove casts a lurid tint over the objects in its immediate vicinity, and diffuses something like warmth around. From the left-hand side of this passage the massive door of every cell on the story opens, and from it alone can be approached. There are 3 of these passages, and 3 of these ranges of cells, one above the other, but in size, furniture, and appearance they are all precisely alike. Prior to the recorder's report being made, all prisoners under the sentence of death are removed from the day room at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and locked up in these cells, where they are allowed a candle until 10 o'clock, and here they remain until 7 next morning. When the warrant for a prisoner's execution arrives, he is removed to the cells and confined in one of them until he leaves it for the scaffold. He is at liberty to walk in the yard, but both in his walks and in his cell he is constantly attended by a turnkey who never leaves him on any pretence. We entered the first cell. It was a stone dungeon, 8 feet long by 6 wide. An iron candlestick was fixed into the wall at the side, and a small high window in the back admitted as much air and light as could struggle in between a double row of heavily crossed iron bars. It contained no other furniture of any description. Conceive the situation of a man spending his last night on earth in this cell, buoyed up with some vague and undefined hope of reprieve, he knew not why, indulging in some wild and visionary idea of escape, he knew not how. Hour after hour of the 3 preceding days allowed him for preparation was fled with a speed which no man living could deem possible. For none but this dying man can know. He has wearied his friends with entreaties, exhausted the attendants with importunities, neglected in his feverish restlessness a timely warning of his spiritual counselor, and now that the illusion is at last dispelled, now that eternity is before him and guilt behind, now that his fears of death amount almost to madness, and an overwhelming sense of his helpless, hopeless state rushes upon him. He is lost and stupefied, and has neither thoughts to turn to nor power to call upon the Almighty Being, from whom alone he can seek mercy and forgiveness, and before whom his repentance can alone avail. Hours have glided by, and still he sits upon the same stone bench, with folded arms, heedless alike of the fast decreasing time before him, and the urgent entreaties of the good man at his side. The feeble light is wasting gradually, and the death-like stillness of the street without, broken only by the rumbling of some passing vehicle, which echoes mournfully through the empty yard, warns him that the night is waning fast away. The deep bell of St. Paul's strikes 1. He heard it. It has roused him. 7 hours left. He paces the narrow limits of his cell with rapid strides, cold drops of terror standing on his forehead, and every muscle of his frame quivering with agony. 7 hours. He suffers himself to be led to his seat, mechanically takes a Bible which is placed in his hand, and tries to read and listen. No, his thoughts will wander. The book is torn and soiled by use, and like the book he read his lessons in at school just 40 years ago. He never bestowed a thought upon it, perhaps since he left it as a child, and yet the place, the time, the room, nay, the very boys he played with, crowd as vividly before him as if they were scenes of yesterday, and some forgotten phrase, some childish word, rings in his ears like the echo of one uttered but a minute since. The voice of the clergyman recalls him to himself. He is reading from the sacred book its solemn promise of pardon for repentance, and its lawful denunciation of obdurate men. He falls upon his knees and clasps his hands to pray. Hush! That sound is what? He starts upon his feet. It cannot be 2 yet. Hark! 2 quarters have struck. The 3rd, the 4th. It is. 6 hours left. Tell him not of repentance. 6 hours repentance for 8 times 6 years of guilt and sin. He buries his face in his hands and throws himself on the bench. Worn with watching and excitement, he sleeps. The same unsettled state of mind pursues him in his dreams. An insupportable load is taken from his breast. He is walking with his wife in a pleasant field, with the bright sky above them, and the fresh, boundless prospect on either side. How different from the stone walls of Newgate. She is looking, not as she did when he saw her for the last time in that dreadful place, but as she used when he loved her, long, long ago, before misery and ill-treatment had altered her looks, and vice had changed his nature. And she is leaning upon his arm and looking up into his face with tenderness and affection, and he does not strike her now, nor rudely shake her from him. And oh, how glad he is to tell her all he had forgotten in that last hurried interview, and to fall upon his knees before her and fervently beseech her pardon for all the unkindness and cruelty that wasted her form and broke her heart. The scene suddenly changes. He is on trial again. There are the judge and jury and prosecutors and witnesses, just as they were before. How full the court is! What a sea of heads, with a gallows too and a scaffold, and now all those people stare at him. Verdict: guilty. No matter, he will escape. The night is dark and cold. The gates have been left open, and in an instant he is in the street, flying from the scene of his imprisonment like the wind. The streets are cleared, the open fields are gained, and the broad, wide country lies before him. Onward he dashes in the midst of darkness, over hedge and ditch, through mud and pool, bounding from spot to spot, with a speed and lightness astonishing even to himself. At length he pauses. He must be safe from pursuit now. He will stretch himself on that bank and sleep till sunrise. A period of unconsciousness succeeds. He wakes, cold and wretched. The dull grey light of morning is stealing into his cell, and falls upon the form of the attendant turnkey. Confused by his dreams, he starts from the uneasy bed in a momentary uncertainty. It is but momentary. Every object in the narrow cell is too frightfully real to admit of doubt or mistake. He is the condemned felon again, guilty and despairing, and in 2 hours more will be dead. End of A Visit to Newgate.